Hello, and welcome to the Screenwriting Workshop. I'm Danny Alcorn, your instructor. I'm a novelist and screenwriter. I've written a young adult novel, dystopian science fiction, and 3 screenplays in a variety of genres, including science fiction, romantic comedy, and medical drama. Let's begin by taking a look at what this class is going to cover. First up, we're going to explore screenwriting. We're going to address the question of why should we write screenplays in the first place? We're also going to look at top-grossing genres and award-winning films and screenplays. I'll give you a quick breakdown on the difference between movies and television. This course is really more about movies, but TV is worth a note. And then I will give you a quick history of television and film, lightning fast, just to sort of give you an overview of where we came from and how we got to where we are now. Then we'll transition and we'll talk about planning your screenplay. We'll begin by talking about story versus plot. And those words are used interchangeably in common conversation all the time, but they actually mean 2 very distinct things, and harnessing the difference between them and understanding how each is used to tell your story will help you make the best screenplay possible. It's definitely a light bulb moment, I know it was for me. Then we'll talk about theme, which is the question of what is this movie really about? Chances are, once you get past the plot details, there's going to be some kernel that you remember about that movie. So we'll talk about some good themes and how to weave a theme into your screenplay. Then we'll talk about getting ideas. Sometimes you get lucky and you just have one spring fully formed, but other times you have to know where to look, and also sometimes you need something to get your creative juices flowing. So we'll talk about some places to look and things to do if you're having trouble getting an idea. Then we'll look at characters, specifically creating compelling characters. We'll talk about your protagonist and your antagonist, as well as your supporting characters, and what makes them feel real and memorable. We'll also talk about archetypes, which sometimes unfairly I think get compared to stereotypes. They're similar, along the same lines, but a little bit different. So we'll get into a discussion of that and how you might be able to use that to help your writing. And finally, we'll talk about the hero's journey, which is Joseph Campbell's take on structure, which leads us into the next section, where we'll talk about modern structures. But before you can do any of that, you really have to get into the logline and the pitch. That's the core of screenwriting ideas. So we'll give you tips and tricks for making those as good as possible so that you have a great idea before you begin writing. We'll also talk about writing a great synopsis, which is a little bit longer, about a page, but when you're trying to condense an entire story down into 450 words, it can definitely seem a little daunting. So we'll tell you how to do that. And then we'll discuss 4-act structure and 3-act structure. The emphasis on this class is going to be the 3-act structure, but 4-act structure is another way of looking at it that is frequently talked about in screenwriting, so we'll take a look at that as well. We'll also discuss scenes and how to make them flow. We'll talk about beginnings and endings and what makes them memorable. And then I'll give you some tips for your outline before you actually dive into the text and the real writing. It's worth it to have a roadmap to tell you how to get where you're going. Then we'll talk about your screenplay. We'll give a quick update on screenwriting software and kind of let you know what's out there. We'll talk about formatting. It's very different than writing a novel, so there are some guidelines that you need to follow. Fortunately, most software these days will do it for you, but it's still worth it to know what it's supposed to look like so you can tell if it's glitching. And then I'm going to recommend most users go with a program called Celtics, and I'll give you a demonstration of how that works. And we'll also talk about what belongs and what doesn't in a screenplay. Sometimes it can be a little bit murky, so we'll try and clear that up. And then we'll talk about how to write good dialogue and action lines and character introductions, which are sort of the trifecta of great screenwriting. And we'll talk about pacing, and we'll also talk about tips for completing your screenplay. I know I have 30 pages orphaned in many a drawer, so we'll talk about how to avoid that. Next up, we'll talk about polishing your screenplay. Workshops are very important, and we'll talk about why they're important and also how to run a good workshop as we go. And that's useful as you're writing and once you're finished as well. But once you've finished, then we need to talk about rewrites. And if we get to the rewrite portion, we'll also revisit the logline and pitch. One of the last things we'll do in this class is I will analyze some great films for you in a variety of genres. And at that point, you'll have the tools to analyze the structure and the theme, and we'll talk about what makes them memorable. And so if you're looking for some ideas, this will tell you how to watch a film analytically. Watching a film analytically is very different than watching it just for enjoyment. Both are completely valid ways to watch a film, but one of them will really help your screenwriting. Because you'll begin to see patterns, and you'll see what you like and what you don't like, and begin to tease out what it is. So in those, I'll break it down by genre. We'll have some dramas, we'll have some comedies, we'll have some suspense, family movies, so that whatever you're working on, you can find something that's sort of close to it, and then branch out from there and apply the skills that we learn in those sections to other movies that might be similar and good reference material for the screenplay that you're working on. And then, once you have a completed screenplay, we'll talk about how to get your screenplay noticed. We'll talk about the difference between agents and managers. We'll talk a little bit about contests. We'll also talk about online resources, which are really booming right now for beginning screenwriters. And then we'll take a quick look at artwork. This is just a quick way to sort of make your material pop if you're working with something like Amazon Studios, where that's an option for you. So we'll take a look at some covers and pitches and sort of ways that movies have been represented to sort of give you some ideas about how yours might be. And then we'll talk about next steps. So, a quick word on the course features. If you look over here to the left, you will see that there are 3 sidebars: materials, questions, and notes. I guess that's your right. So the materials, this is where you'll find PDFs of documents, handouts, test drives, where you'll get a chance to try some of the techniques that we discuss in this class on your own. So that's great, check that out. There's also a questions sidebar. If you have questions at any time, please feel free, click on that, type it in, I'll get back to you. And then finally, notes. You're welcome to take notes as I talk. A nifty feature is that when you type a note, it keeps track of where you were in the lesson. So if you want to go back and watch something again, it's very easy. You just go find your note, click it, and it will take you right there. So yeah, those are the course features. And then finally, there's a spoiler alert, where I'm going to warn you ahead of time that I'm going to assume that you have seen these 4 movies. I'll be pretty good about not giving away major details or endings of movies that I talk about. But these 4, Star Wars Episode 4, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Titanic, and The Lion King, I'm gonna assume you've seen. So if you haven't, this is a great chance to go out. Maybe you own them, maybe you don't. Rent them from a library, borrow them from a friend. Take a look at those. We'll be using those to talk primarily about structure in a couple of lessons. So, finally, you can look at writingacademy.com for some of our other resources, and as well as some of our other classes in novel writing and adaptation, if those are things that interest you as well. So in our next lesson, we'll be addressing the question of why should we write screenplays? I'll see you there. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the question, why should we write screenplays? And this was a question I definitely asked myself, because I was a novelist before I was a screenwriter. And as I think the common knowledge goes, the book is always better. So, if that's true, why should we write screenplays? Well, I found the beginnings of my answer when I had an idea that I was convinced was going to be a novel. Great character, interesting setup. It was sort of what happens when Hamlet met Blade Runner. And I thought this is going to be fantastic. But as I started working with the characters and trying to structure it, what I realized was something was off. As a novel, it just kept falling flat. I felt like I was withholding information from my readers in a very awkward way. I couldn't quite get the character to sound right. I actually made it about 10,000 words in before I realized I didn't have an idea for a novel. I had an idea for a screenplay. Which brings me to our first point, which is that some ideas are more cinematic than others. Something that is very visual, action-based, something that requires keeping a secret about the protagonist that perhaps even the protagonist doesn't know about themselves tend to work better as screenplays than novels. So that's definitely one reason to write a screenplay and not a novel, is that you've got a situation on your hands where the storytelling techniques that you use in a screenplay simply work better for this idea. Also, it's faster to write a screenplay. Now, the time that it takes to think of the idea and work it through its outline and beginning stages is comparable, I will admit. However, if you think about the number of words that go into a medium-length novel, you're probably in the range of 100,000 to 150,000 words. Now, 120 pages of screenplay may sound like a lot, but when you think about the number of words per page, it's actually significantly less than you would find in a novel. So I find that the actual writing process, once I begin scene 1, getting to page 120, is much quicker than it would be to write a novel. So if I've got an idea that I really want to get out there and I just want it to be complete, a screenplay may be a better way to go than a novel, which will take considerably more time to write. You also get to use different storytelling techniques, which I find to be an interesting artistic challenge. When you write a novel, you have the luxury of being able to get inside your character's head and let your audience know how they're feeling, what they think. In a screenplay, you simply can't do that. You have to find a way to visualize and externalize all of the internal conflict that you would have the luxury of just being able to explain, or almost use a voiceover type in a novel. And so I find that to be very, very good and very artistically stretching for me. Also, telling visual stories is much easier, obviously, when you're going to get to see it on screen than it would be to read it in a novel. And the ability to come up with intense visuals that are compelling and new is a really great part of screenwriting. Finding a new way to describe something is always really wonderful. And finally, it's also good to build up your writer's portfolio. If you're ever trying to get a writer's job, they're probably going to want to see what you can do. And so having some completed screenplays under your belt that you can pull out and say, this is my work, will really be beneficial to you. So that's another good reason to write a screenplay. Perhaps the most important reason, however, that you should write anything is your passion. And passion is one of the dramatic elements that we talk about in novel writing workshop and young adult writing workshop. And this one is specifically why you want to write this story. What is it about this idea here and now that is really calling to you? It's what's going to get you from page 1 all the way to page 120. If you've got a nifty idea that you think is kind of cool and maybe could be really commercially successful, you might have trouble making it through the middle of Act 2 because it can be very long and it can feel, like it will never end. But if you have that burning passion that you absolutely must tell this story for some reason, that is what's going to get you to page 120. And so as you begin to come up with your idea that you'd like to work on in this course for your screenplay, I encourage you to think about your passion and why it is you want to tell this story. What is it that appeals to you? What is it? Is it something that you want to go see at the theater? Is it something that isn't out there and you wish was? Does it have a message that you think is important? Is it part of your own life that you think is important? Just begin to think about those things and it will really help you when you begin to develop your idea further. So that's a quick little introduction into why one should write a screenplay. In our next lesson, we're going to shift gears a little bit and we're going to start looking at the genres that are out there, specifically the top grossing genres. So I'll see you there. Hello, and welcome back. Well, now that you've had a chance to think about why you want to write screenplays, let's take a look at what's out there, specifically what genres there are and how well they've traditionally done at the box office. So, this table comes from a website called The Numbers and represents data from 1995 to 2012, so this is fairly recent history. The Numbers was launched in 1997 as a free resource for industry professionals and movie fans so that they could keep track of business information, things like revenue, about movies. And originally they tracked just 300 films, but now they have more than 13,000 in their database, so this is quite a collection of data. So as you can see here, the top grossing genre in the last 20 years has been comedy by a fairly significant margin, followed by adventure, drama, action, thriller and suspense, and finally romantic comedy. You can see that they have a fairly significant percent of the market share. There are some genres that you see are not represented on here, like horror, musical, western, black comedy, and these all represent smaller shares. So this is sort of your quick snapshot of what's out there and what's likely to be playing at the box office the next time you want to go buy movie tickets. So perhaps maybe a little bit more informative would be to see a list of the top 10 grossing films of recent history as well. So here, this comes from Box Office Mojo, which is a website run by IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, and is another tool for keeping track of how movies do. And here you can see that by a very wide margin, Avatar has grossed the most money of any film in recent history, followed by Titanic, so James Cameron was having a very good couple of films there. The Avengers, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2, neither of those are particularly surprising. Transformers, Dark of the Moon is a little bit more unexpected, I think. Lord of the Rings, Skyfall, Dark Knight Rises, Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest, and Toy Story 3. So this list is a little bit homogeneous, I think. Titanic, obviously, romance. The others mostly fall into the adventure or action category, I think. There's a lot of superhero-type movies on this list. And then Toy Story 3 is kind of the definite standout as a kids' movie, but a kids' movie that definitely appealed to an adult audience, which may explain its commercial success. Now, how useful is this information? I have to admit that while I find this interesting and good for your edification, in terms of what you're actually going to be working on for your own screenplay, it's not necessarily what you want to focus on. Just because Avatar was a huge box office success does not mean that the next huge box office success is going to be a science fiction movie. It could be, but there's really no way to tell what's going to be successful next. It's much easier in hindsight to say, oh, well, yes, it had a great appeal to a wide variety of people, and it came out at a time where there wasn't a lot of competition, and that's why it was so successful. But predicting that next thing is much harder to do. And in fact, quality may not even be tied to this list. Some of the films on this list are certainly wonderful. Some of them may be your thing, maybe not. So that's not really how I like to measure the success of my screenplays. But I like to present this information just so that you've got an idea about what's out there, what people like, and what they are willing to pay to see. It's always good to keep that on the back of your mind, even if it's not at the forefront. So, in our next lesson, we're going to look at a slightly more informative category, I think. And we're going to take a look at award-winning movies and screenplays. So we'll see you there. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to turn our attention toward award-winning films and screenplays. Now, I would like to preface this discussion with the disclaimer that I am by no means suggesting that winning an Academy Award is the only way to judge a film's success. There are many other metrics for assessing how successful a film was, including its enjoyability, artistic merit, and its box office success. So, take everything with a grain of salt. But I think that the reason that we need to look at this is that as someone who wants to be a screenwriter, you need to be aware of what's going on in the business, what's out there, and what's winning awards. So let's take a look at the Academy Award winners for Best Picture for the last 25 years or so. Now, when I look at this list, I've certainly heard of all these movies, I've seen most of them, and some of my favorite movies are on this list. And I bet that most of you feel similarly. But there are some years on here where I can remember there being a little bit of an upset at the award ceremony, being surprised that one movie won over another, which is maybe an indicator of why awards are not the be-all, end-all when it comes to deciding what's good and what you like. Let's take a quick tour through cinema history of some surprising wins and losses, beginning in 1939, which was admittedly a fabulous year for cinema, so the competition was very tough. But in 1939, The Wizard of Oz, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Goodbye Mr. Chips all lost to Gone with the Wind. Now, The Wizard of Oz has certainly stood the test of time and is even today being reinterpreted and reimagined on the screen and on the stage very frequently. And I'm betting that most of you have either seen or at least heard of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Goodbye Mr. Chips. Now, Gone with the Wind is a fabulous film, and many of you have probably seen that too. So some years the competition is just really stiff. In 1940, one of my favorite movies of all time, Philadelphia Story, lost to Rebecca. Again, stiff competition. Which of those movies has had the longer time in the public conscious? You know, winning an Academy Award does not necessarily guarantee that your movie will be around and watched forever. And 1941. 1941 breaks my heart because this year, Citizen Kane, one of the greatest movies ever made, lost to How Green Was My Valley. Now, Citizen Kane is talked about in essentially every introductory film course out there, and is considered by many to be the origin of modern cinema. And yet in 1941, it lost the Academy Award for Best Picture. So perhaps this is a lesson in why Academy Awards are not the be-all, end-all when it comes to determining the success and longevity of a film. A few more recent examples are that in 2009, Avatar lost to The Hurt Locker. Now, even though Avatar was a groundbreaking film technologically and ushered in a new age of 3D cinema, I think the reason it lost is because The Hurt Locker was so topical. It was about something that really hit home for the audience of the time and really resonated with the crowd. And so I think that that's why The Hurt Locker won. It was what was on everybody's mind at that time. And yet, in 2012, Zero Dark 30 lost to Argo. And the same argument can't necessarily be made in that case. So perhaps sometimes it's just fickle. So here's the list of Academy Award winners for Best Picture again. But what I think is sort of interesting to compare is this list against the list of Academy Award winners for Best Screenplay, which is right here. Now in green, I have highlighted the 5 films that won both the Academy Award for Best Screenplay and the Academy Award for Best Picture. And these are interesting to look at because something about them must have really resonated with the audience of the time. Now, Best Screenplay, you're looking at things like well-structured, character development, good writing in a way that Best Picture is maybe catering to a sort of larger conception of what makes the film good. And so this is a very interesting list, and I encourage you to look at them. Maybe you've seen some of these movies, maybe you haven't, but this week's test drive will give you a chance to either revisit an old favorite or watch something new. Because what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to choose one and rewatch it, and think about what made that particular film suited for both of the awards. Do you agree that it should have won either or both? What made it appealing? What made it so good? And did you like it? You may not have, and that's okay. But if you don't, can you still understand why it won? So this is just an exercise for you to sort of start testing out analytical viewing. So I encourage you to give it a try and ask yourself some questions about what made that film good, what made it win, and whether or not you really liked it. And I'll see you next time. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the differences between movies and television. Now, that may seem sort of self-evident on the surface, and indeed there are some things that are rather obvious from the start, such as the budget. Obviously, a movie takes a lot more money to make than an average television show. However, I will say that the last even 5 or 10 years, I think, have shown large changes in the way that television gets made. Now there's sort of 2 schools of thought. You certainly have your sitcom school of thought, which is designed to be significantly cheaper than a movie. You have one location, you may even be shooting with multiple cameras at one time, which cuts down on the amount of time that it takes to film an episode, and it's very low budget. One location, a few recurring characters, and you're set. However, there is the Lost in Game of Thrones school of thought, which is trying to look like a movie. Now, if you look at those, they have incredibly high production value and have really sort of been upping the game in terms of what's expected out of your average 1-hour drama on television these days. Length is also a fairly significant difference between the two. However, it does cut both ways. On the one hand, an average drama television episode is 1 hour long, which is much shorter than a movie. However, a season could be anywhere from 10 to 20 episodes, so that's 10 to 20 hours. And you could have multiple seasons. So, in some ways, you're looking at a significantly greater amount of time in which to tell a story in television versus movies. And this is related to the time commitment for the audience, which I think is often overlooked but is very important. When you go to the movies, yes, you're plunking down your $10 for a movie ticket, but you're only giving up 2 hours of your life. to get invested in a television show is going to require significantly more time on your part. So, for instance, I know some people who refused to watch Lost, even with its reviews as good as they were, until the show ended and they knew whether or not it was going to have a satisfactory ending. I'm sure that most of us have had the experience of being very invested in a television show only to have it canceled or end unsatisfactorily. And after you've spent 40, 50, 60 hours of your life watching something, that can be very frustrating. So in some ways, I think when you write television, you're actually under significantly more pressure than when you write screenplays for movies. Another difference is the production schedule. You have a lot of time to make a movie if you want. It usually takes a year, 2 years between starting the process and calling the cut on the final take, and then you have the editing process, obviously. A television show has to do all of that, but it has to crank it out in a very fast manner, probably in a week or two per episode, which is crazy if you think about something like Lost or Game of Thrones. Can you imagine the amount of time and manpower that it must take to do that? And so you have to balance your narrative with your material economy. And one way that that's done in television is they will set up very similar shots. If you look at a lot of television shows, they sort of have a signature shot. Think about West Wing. There's a lot of corridors in that set. And so what they will do is they'll do a walking shot where 2 or 3 people will be walking down the corridor, having a conversation, turn many corners, and do something that looks very complicated. But if you look from episode to episode, that shot, or a very similar one, is in almost every single episode. Lost has many shots going through wooded jungle areas where characters are running along one side of a bunch of trees and the camera is following them on the other side of a bunch of trees. It looks very complicated, and I'm sure it is very complicated to pull something like that off. However, you get practice at it so that you can set it up very quickly, and that's something that you don't really have to worry about in movies, because in movies you can spend 2 days setting up a single shot if that's what the director wants, because you never have to do it again. So it could be very impractical, beautifully artistic, but it doesn't have to make quite as much economic sense as it does in a television show. Okay, so also television shows tend to favor character and performance over plot. And that's just because if you think about an entire season arc, you could probably manage to write 120 or at least a 3-hour movie that did almost all of the plot, but you certainly would not have enough time to get to know the characters. And television is also more repetitive than movies are, because you run the risk of people missing an episode here or there, and so you have to keep catching them back up on what was going on. And if you look at sort of older television shows, which we'll get into in our next lecture, they were probably more repetitive within the actual episode. Now it tends to be more of the previously on style of catching you up on what you may have missed. That's something that you just don't need to worry about within a movie, and so the only time you would really be using repetition in a movie was for artistic or dramatic effect. You also have much more rigid time formats in television, which can be somewhat constraining, because in addition to only having an hour to work with, you're also dealing with commercial breaks, which is something that movies also don't have to worry about. And movies, even though you almost never see one that's over 3 hours, and frankly you almost never see one that's over 2.5 hours, pretty much anywhere from 90 minutes to 2 hours is about what you can expect out of a movie. But there's a significant amount of interplay between, if you think about something like The Avengers, which is between 2.5 and 3 hours, Titanic is 3 hours, Avatar is close to 3 hours, Lord of the Rings, certainly that's quite long, especially the extended editions. But then you have, kids' movies, which could be as low as 80 minutes. So that's significantly more room to wiggle when it comes to a movie. And also, the audience relationship to the movie or program, I think, is quite different. You have a lot of people who have a favorite movie that they absolutely love and would love to tell you about, but it's more of a thing that they really like. Whereas if they really like a television show, it seems like it's less of a thing and they're more attached to the people in it, and it seems more like it's a real seeming thing or place for them. Which brings me to what I think is the most important difference, and that's the relationship to the characters. And I think that if if you think about your favorite character in a movie, they're probably somebody who had great dialogue, had great action, was kind of cool or quirky, and you really liked rooting for. But if you think about your favorite character from a television show, you could probably talk about them for a really long time. You could tell me what their favorite food was, what they liked, what they didn't like, where they had worked, what their parents were like, who their best friend was, did they have any pets, weird habits, did they sing opera, because you have so much longer to get to know a character in a television show, and it's in your living room. That's the real difference, is that television is a very personal thing, whereas movies still remain sort of a social thing. You go to the movie theater to see the summer blockbuster release with all of your friends, you sit with a crowd of people and you watch this. Television shows come to your living room, or these days your laptop, and you sit there alone and you watch it. And you have a very personal relationship with it. People are always apologizing for their guilty pleasures. Oh, I watch Grey's Anatomy, but I love it, but I know I shouldn't. But it's because you have that personal relationship. You feel like the people in it are your friends. You feel like they're real, and I think that you bond with them in a very different way than you bond with movie characters. Now, as I've said before, this is really more about movie writing than it is about television writing. But I think that knowing that that distinction is there between the way that you relate to the characters, when you go to write a movie, you should do everything in your power to make the character seem as real as possible. And watching some television shows that you really like and you really feel connected to can definitely give you some insights into how they managed to do that. What was it about your favorite character from that television show? What did you learn about them that really made them pop and seem real? And so that's sort of what this week's test drive is about. And so what I'd like you to do this week is to take a page, fold it in half, top to bottom, creating 2 columns. And at the top of one column, write your favorite character from a television show. And in the other column, write the name of a character from a favorite character from a movie. And list attributes about them, facts that you know about them in each category, or in each column rather. And I'm betting you'll discover that one of the columns is significantly more full than the other one. And think about that. Think about what it was that made you lean towards those characters, and what the differences are between them. So mull that over, and I will see you in the next lesson for a discussion of the history of television and cinema. See you then. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, I'm going to take you through a very quick history of film and television. So, to kick things off, in 1895, the Lumiere brothers created the first motion picture camera, and they filmed the workers leaving the Lumiere factory. So those very short clips were all that could really be handled by the early equipment. So the period from 1905 to 1915 represents the Nickelodeon era, which is exactly what it sounds like. You would pay a nickel to watch a very short little clip that was silent in some sort of movie viewer. And then by the early 1920s, the studio system was in place. And of course, Hollywood as we know it was born. Now, the films that were originally being made were silent, but as technology developed, the very first talkie was The Jazz Singer in 1927, and that was the very first feature film presented with sound, and that was a game changer and kicked off what we recognize as cinema today. So one thing of note in early film history is the Hays Code. So in 1930, the movie industry instituted a production code that governed the moral content of movies produced by American studios. Now, the code didn't actually go into effect until 1934, so there's actually a really fascinating period of film history between the rumblings of the code being introduced and the actual enforcement of the code, where there are some things that you definitely would not expect to see that were, even by today's standards, somewhat risque, being filmed prior to 1934. But after that, the code goes into effect and stays in effect until 1968. And the Hays Code, if you've ever wondered why in early cinema married couples sleep in separate beds, that's why. So the 1930s to the 1950s represent the glory days of the studio system. And you have the Big Five: 20th Century Fox, RKO Pictures, Paramount Pictures, Warner Brothers, and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer dominating there, with the little three: Universal Pictures, Columbia Pictures, and United Artists. Some of those are still around, some of them aren't. And then the Hays Code ends in 1968 when it's replaced with the MPAA rating system, which you're familiar with, GPG, etc. Modern cinema was really kicked off by the Paramount decision, which was the US versus Paramount Pictures in 1948. And it was a game changer for the way that movies were made, because it changed how distribution was regulated. Prior to this, production companies would own their own theaters, so they would churn out perhaps hundreds of movies a year with guaranteed distribution to the theaters that they owned. So this decision said that the production companies could no longer own their own theaters. So this led to fewer films being made, and studios becoming more selective about the films that they chose to greenlight and put money into, because they were no longer guaranteed distribution, because they had to appeal to third-party theaters. And then in the mid-70s, you see the rise of the blockbuster strategy, which is the summer hit that everybody's talking about, that everybody has to go see, that's the multi-million-dollar budget and hopefully even more multi-million-dollar gross revenue. Today's movies, summer blockbusters are getting bigger and bigger. CGI has again been another game changer, because now you can create literally completely alien worlds with completely alien characters. Just have to take a look at Avatar to see how that can be done. And the wide release format is still dominating Hollywood, but in the next 10 years we may see a shift in distribution favoring streaming over the internet and things like that, but only time will tell. So let's switch gears and talk a little bit about television now. So the first successful experiments in television actually happened back in the 1920s, and television sets were being sold at the end of the 1930s. But TV didn't really catch on until after World War II. In the 1940s, the number of homes with a television measured in the thousands. But by 1951, there were almost 12 million television sets in American homes. And by 1955, half of all US homes had a television. So in the 1950s and 60s, you see broadcasting dominated by three networks: CBS, NBC, and ABC. And then in the 70s, you see the rise of the cable networks. 1980s, you see video cassettes and recorders becoming popular. DVDs obviously come in the between that and the rise of the internet. And in the 2010s, we were seeing the rise of streaming video from sites like Hulu and Amazon. So taking a step back again, if you look at early television programming, what you see is that they were very constrained in terms of screen size and speaker quality. You had very restricted shot scale, locations, and sound design, just because the technology had not been perfected yet, and so you had to have very bright lights on the actors. It was very unpleasant to be an early television actor, because it was 10 times worse than being on the stage. You literally had spotlights pointed at you to make you show up on the screen. And with this new technology and this new way of telling stories, nobody really knew what they were dealing with yet. It was a totally new medium, and so they borrowed heavily from radio and theater, which had been around for a lot longer. And so you saw things that were anthology programs, that were sort of the theatrical model. Tune in every week and see a different play, a different production. You would have a different cast and premise each week. There was no continuity from week to week. Then, as the technology developed and people started thinking about what they could do, you saw the rise of episodic programs. And these are things like Dragnet or Perry Mason, where you had a continuing cast and premise, but you had a new storyline each week. So every week, Perry Mason gets a new client and goes through the process of proving that they were innocent, going to court and finding evidence and presenting it, and then ultimately getting the innocent verdict. So that's what you would tune in for every week. But you got to see the same characters, but you got to see them do a new story. Then, as television goes on and the decades roll by, you start to see a rise in partially serialized programs. And some examples of things that would fall into this category are things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, House, Grey's Anatomy. You have continuing characters from week to week, but you have a reliance on the episodic format in that every week it's sort of in the earlier seasons of Buffy, it's Monster of the Week. In something like House, every episode has a patient who's a case. But you start to see the introduction of elements that continue from week to week, and the plot lines that span, at first maybe a double episode, then a triple episode, and then maybe you'll have half a season devoted to a character's relationship developing. And then finally, you see recently a move to completely serial programs. And the ultimate example here is Lost, where there is almost no within-episode wrap-up every week. You are following an entire season. Every season has an arc, and the storylines, at any given point, you may be following 10, 12, maybe even 15 or 16 different stories within a single episode, but you're following them every week for an entire season of a show. One example that I really like to give of how this developed is Star Trek, because there were so many different Star Trek series throughout this shift. So if you look at the earliest ones of the original series and Next Generation, they fall solidly in the episodic programs. Deep Space Nine began in the early 90s, and I would say that the first 3 seasons of it are also in the episodic model. But the shift happens in the mid-90s, and so Deep Space Nine picks that up, and the second half of that show begins to become more and more serialized until the final 10 episodes of Season 7 are really one long plot. And then Voyager falls into a similar time frame where it's a little bit more serialized from the very get-go. And then Lost, of course, is the science fiction show that really created and was a game changer for how television gets filmed. So that is your lightning fast summary of film and television history. I hope that that has been interesting for you to sort of get a little bit of the lay of the land. If any of that is interesting to you, I do encourage you to do your reading, because the history is fascinating and there were so many colorful characters throughout the years that there's tons of great stuff in there. So I hope you found that enjoyable, and I will look forward to seeing you in our next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. Well, now you're ready to start planning your very own screenplay. However, before you can start planning a screenplay, you have to have an idea. Now, maybe you already have one, and if so, that's fantastic. But if not, this is a lesson that will give you some tips and tricks for getting ideas and getting those creative juices flowing. So first, ask yourself, where do ideas come from? And the answer is everywhere. You can find an idea in a news story, an anecdote from friends and family, even from just daydreaming. What I find is that anytime I ask the question, what would happen if I have a story idea? Similarly, what if someone wanted? That's another story idea. Finally, the more fully formed version of this idea is, what if a blank character had to do blank? Now, that pretty much are your building blocks. And your job as a creative writer is simply to keep your eyes and ears open. You're out on the street and you see an intriguing person who maybe sticks out for some reason. They're wearing an interesting article of clothing and it makes you wonder where they got it. Well, where did they get it? What could its significance be? Why is it important? Is this an ordinary day for them, or is something out of the ordinary? I frequently have the experience of just wandering around and I'll see one moment, a flash of something, and for just a second I'll have an entire story start to finish in my head. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't usually last. So, you've got a great idea, you have a brilliant idea for a story. Now, how do you remember it? Well, some people keep a journal. I have friends who do this. They've always got a little moleskin notebook with them, and when inspiration strikes, they take it out, open it up, and jot down some notes. Now, this usually doesn't work for me, one, because I never have the notebook with me when I seem to need it, and also, I'm afraid of losing it. But what I do always have with me is my cell phone, and my smartphone has a note program in it. So, sometimes when I'm out and about, I'll get an idea for a story, and I'll jot it down in there. Then it's archived, it backs up to my computer, I don't have to worry about losing it, and I've always got it with me. So that's something that I definitely recommend you think about. Now, you can also create a folder on your computer for story ideas, and I have one of these. And anytime I've got something that's kind of half-baked and not really fully formed yet, but I think it's worth remembering, I'll jot it down, write down some notes, and save it under some name I hopefully will remember later, and put it in this folder. Also, one thing that I find to be really helpful to do is to tell your friends about your what-if questions. And sometimes they have great ideas too, if they're willing to be a good sounding board. But a good gauge too is just whether or not they're interested. If you ask them a what-if question and they kind of give you that so what look, you probably need to keep digging and find a deeper root and more engaging part of that issue or question that you think is an interesting idea. If they're not as interested in it, I do really recommend bouncing ideas off of them to see what does pique their interest, what they would pay to see. These are definitely things that are worth having. I think that one of the most important things for any creative writer to have is a friend who's willing to be that sounding board, who's willing to just sit there and put up with long periods of silence while you say, well, I'm thinking about doing a story about a character who works in a bookshop. Pause. The friend may jump in and ask something about what kind of bookshop, and you say, well, I hadn't really thought about it yet, but maybe it's a specialty bookshop, maybe it's antique books, and then you can just continue to sort of spitball these ideas until you get something that's more fully formed. I always encourage you, once you've got your situation, now that what-if question is pretty broad, and you could ask what-if questions about a lot of things that would describe the same story. For example, what if a boy who didn't know he was special had to defeat an evil lord? Now, think about how many stories that could be. That could be Harry Potter, that could be Star Wars. So you do have to put your own spin on things and continue delving deeper and deeper. However, the beginning is certainly the what if, and that what if is your sort of gateway to creativity. Keep asking those what if questions of yourself. Sometimes I'll even do this in a Word document or a notebook if I get stuck. I'll write down, what if this happens, what if this happens, what if this happens, and keep pushing myself to sort of try and define the situation and the character that I'm playing with. So once you've got sort of the seed of your idea, push it in different directions. And don't be afraid of pushing it in a direction that it doesn't necessarily end up going. Lots of times I'll sort of have branch points where I'll think, well, if the mother dies, the story goes this way, but if she doesn't, it goes this way. And you can kind of develop them in parallel for a while until you figure out what's jiving for you. And so this is definitely when it's a good time to sort of keep free-form notes. If you're the kind of person who thinks that once it's written on a typed document on the computer, it is like set in stone, don't do it that way. Get a journal. I often find that that's sort of me, where once I write it down, I think of it being a little bit too set. And so if I'm sort of in the brainstorming phase, I'll pull out a pen and paper, because then I can cross things out, change them up, draw arrows, and it's a much more liberated experience for me. So you need to find something that works for you and stick with it once you figure out what sort of your creative process is. But I would urge you to come up with some kind of system so that you don't lose all those great notes, because nothing could be worse than losing your entire notebook full of ideas. So I will also say that sometimes you'll end up working on an idea and you'll be really excited about it for a day, 2 days, and then it will completely fall by the wayside. But if you keep track of it, you would be amazed how often a year or two later you come back and go, oh yeah, that was a really cool idea. And you take it back out, you dust it off, you've learned a few things since you thought of it the first time, and maybe this time it works for you. I've definitely done that before, where I'll take something out that I had put away and I thought, oh, this is unwritable, and then several years later, lo and behold, I've learned something, I've seen something that inspired me, and I know what to do with it. So that's sort of if the ideas are flowing, what to do. But what happens if you're sitting there and you think, wow, I have no ideas. What am I going to do now? This is when you need a kickstart. And this was a great exercise that was told to me, although I was so skeptical when I tried it myself. But here's what it is. Read a self-help book. I'm not kidding. Go find a self-help book about a topic that you'd like to write about. So for example, I was taking a class at the time about writing romantic comedies. And so we had to go out and find a self-help book from the love and romance section and read it. Now, our assignment was basically to figure out what it thought the problem with love was. But this would work for almost anything that you could find a self-help book on. And if you ask yourself to sort of skim this book and identify, this book thinks the problem with X is blank. And then pitch an idea that is essentially based on that. And I was very skeptical of this. I didn't think it was going to work at all, but I went out and I did it, and I found a book called The Regal Rules for Girls. And when I saw this, I thought that it was ridiculous, but wonderful. And so I took it home, and I read it, and it was hysterically funny. It was very tongue-in-cheek, but it is pretty much an honest-to-God guide for American women who want to move overseas and marry British noblemen. That's pretty much what this book is. So this book thinks the problem with love is that love can only be found across the Atlantic with a British nobleman who preferably has a title. This was too good. I couldn't possibly pass this up. And so I started thinking about all of the ways that following this advice could completely backfire on someone. And I created a character who fit sort of the milieu that I was going for of this romantic comedy genre, and ended up with a really killer pitch. And I had been so convinced that there was no way I was going to end up writing the idea that I pitched from this romantic comedy, or this romance book, and yet it was one of the best experiences I've ever had coming up with a pitch. It was so much fun. I wrote the entire screenplay. It was just a barrel of laughs. So I really do recommend this. This week's supplemental material, you will find a worksheet for using a self-help book to sort of get the ideas coming and help yourself along. There's some questions to answer sort of along the lines of, what is the problem with X? And then sort of leading you through it to identify a character who would be an interesting person to put in the situation of following or not following the advice in the book. You'll also find that I've filled out the worksheet for How to Catch an Englishman, which was the story that I based or was inspired by Jeremy Fine's The Regal Rules for Girls. So take a look at those two things. You can see my experience on the one hand, and also give it a try yourself if that's something that you're interested in. Even if it's not right now and you've already got a great idea, definitely file it away for a rainy day. And I will see you in the next lesson for a discussion of plot versus story. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be discussing plot versus story. Now, these two words get used interchangeably very often, but in fact, there is a distinction between them. It begins with the fact that plot is your character's physical journey. Story is your character's emotional journey. Now, what I mean by that is that plot is anything your character does. Anything that gets them from point A to point B. Getting up and walking across the room is a plot element. Story is how the character is changing emotionally. This is related to your character flaw, which we'll discuss in a later lesson. But in the process of overcoming the flaw, there's a change that happens for your protagonist. And so anything that is an element of change along that way will count as story. Another way to break it down is that plot is action and story is reaction. In screenplays and movies, you frequently hear the shot reverse shot with the action and reaction shots. And that's very much what this is. Doing something is plot, creating an action. The reaction is revealing something about the character's emotional state at the time. When you write novels, you consider plot to be external and story to be internal. And while that is still kind of true for a movie protagonist, your challenge is to figure out how to show that internal, because you don't have the option of telling like you do in a novel. Now, even in novel writing, it is better if you can figure out how to show the character's internal emotional state than to simply tell your audience that so-and-so was sad. But for example, one way to reveal story through showing in a screenplay would be, instead of saying that somebody was sad, which would count as an internal attribution which doesn't belong in a screenplay, you could say that they began to weep. Now, weeping is an external manifestation of sadness, and as an audience, we're going to get that. So your job as a good screenwriter is to externalize all of those internal feelings so that the audience will be right along with your character for their journey throughout the course of the movie. And so that's a major difference between screenplays and novels, is that in the novels you have the luxury of being able to sit back and take a breather and say, well, I was sad because of that. That doesn't work in a screenplay. You really have to force yourself to think visually and figure out how to externalize all of those emotional feelings that the character is having so that we will connect and understand their emotional journey in addition to their plot story. So I've got some examples for you. To begin, let's talk about Silence of the Lambs. So in this movie, what happens is that Clarice tracks down a killer, and that's plot. However, on her journey, Clarice overcomes her lack of self-confidence in order to catch the killer, and that's story. Similarly, in Finding Nemo, Marlin goes looking for his son. That's plot. The entire journey that he takes with Dory looking for Nemo is all plot. However, on that journey, he overcomes his overprotectiveness of Nemo, and that's story. And his overcoming of that overprotectiveness allows him to let Nemo grow up and actually save the day himself. My last example for you is Mrs. Doubtfire. And what happens in this movie is that Robin Williams' character, Daniel Hillard, dresses up as a nanny, Mrs. Doubtfire, so that he can see his kids. That's all plot. The character's emotional story in this is that he must grow up. He must realize that he has to let his wife go, and in some ways let Mrs. Doubtfire go as well and just be grown-up Daniel. And that's story. So, as you continue to develop your own screenplay idea, begin to think of it in terms of what's happening, the plot, and how the character, your protagonist, is changing. That's story. And those two concepts are definitely interrelated. You can't really have a story without a plot, and you can't really have a plot without a story. So, see how they continue to relate to one another, and we'll discuss them in further lectures. So for now, keep those in mind, and I'll see you next time. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about theme, which is really the question, what was that movie really about? Now, you go out to the movies with your friends, and you end up talking about a lot of plot details when it's over. And yeah, sure, there was a zombie apocalypse, but that's not really what the movie was about. What the movie really was about could be, say, love conquers all. Now, that's the emotional kernel that everything ties back to. So all of the different elements that we're going to get into play as you develop your screenplay, from the protagonist to the antagonist to their flaws to the setting and location, it's all going to tie back to whatever you decide your theme is. And the theme is not complicated. It is almost always expressed in a single word or a very short phrase. So let's take a look at some movies and their themes and sort of get an idea of what kinds of things are commonly out there. So in Star Wars Episode 4, the theme of that movie is believe in yourself, use the Force, trust yourself. Harry Potter is similar in that as well. That sort of the overall theme of that saga is believe in yourself. Harry has to believe that he has the power to defeat Voldemort before he can get to the conclusion. Finding Nemo. This is an interesting one because originally, when I was thinking about Marlin, the protagonist of this movie, his flaw, I think, is overprotectiveness. But the theme of the movie is not really overprotectiveness. I think the theme of the movie is put the past behind you. Because the reason Marlin is overprotective of his son Nemo is because of what happened to his wife and their other children. And it is not until he is able to put that behind him that he is able to overcome his overprotectiveness of Nemo. The Lion King. The theme of this movie is responsibility. Simba must take responsibility for his pride and his home and return to Pride Rock and face Scar and not continue living with Timon and Pumbaa in his carefree existence out in the jungle. Catch Me If You Can. This is an example I wanted to include of how to sort of keep digging down and finding what is truly the emotional core and the kernel that is the theme of the film. Because on the surface of things, originally I thought, well, the theme of Catch Me If You Can is running from problems doesn't solve them. However, that also stems from an inability to face the past. Leonardo DiCaprio's character in that is never able to face the fact that his family fell apart. That's what he's running from through the entire movie, and it is not until he faces that he's able to return home to some semblance of a life. Easy A, a romantic comedy starring Emma Stone. In this film, very near the beginning, she tells one little lie that very quickly snowballs to an entire school and gives her a reputation that she doesn't deserve. So the theme of this film is certainly honesty, as she attempts to deal with this snowball effect that her lie has created. Doubt, it's right there in the title. The theme of that film is doubt. And The Princess Bride, a classic. Definitely the theme is love conquers all in that movie. Now, one interesting thing to note about theme is that it is almost always directly related to the protagonist's flaw. So here's a list of common character flaws that you'll give your protagonist, but we'll discuss these in much greater detail in the protagonist lecture. But just to throw a few out there that come up very frequently, I think that one of the most common is lack of self-confidence, particularly in genres aimed at teenagers and young adults. That's a huge one out there. Lack of self-worth, low self-esteem, insecurity also come up a lot. Inability to put the past behind, inability to face the past, inability to trust. These are all very common ones. But again, we'll discuss these in more detail in the protagonist lecture. But you can see how, for example, Lion King lack of self-confidence is arguably Simba's flaw in that. And that lack of self-confidence leads him to believe that he's not capable of taking responsibility for his pride in his home. And it is only when he overcomes that lack of self-confidence that he's able to return to Pride Rock. So that's sort of an example of how these things tie together. But again, we'll get into that more. The supplemental material for this week includes a list of character flaws that you can begin to sort of look at and try and identify some of your favorite movie protagonists and what their flaw was and how it related back to the theme. So I will leave you with that, and I will see you next time. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be taking a quick look at who's in your screenplay. So a couple of people are obvious right off the bat. You're going to need a protagonist and an antagonist. Now let's break those words down a little bit. So protagonist comes from pro, which means for, and agonist, which means working, which means that your protagonist is working for something. Now your antagonist, anti is against, so they're working against whatever the protagonist is working for. So this sets up lots of conflict between the two of them. Your antagonist is actively working against your protagonist, who is trying to achieve something. The nemesis is an interesting character who may or may not end up in your final screenplay, but this character is somebody who may appear to be the antagonist for a while, but they're not the larger bad guy. So, for example, in the Harry Potter series, Voldemort is certainly the antagonist of that series. However, there are many other characters who could be considered a form of a nemesis throughout. Umbridge, Wormtail, these are all people who are not the ultimate evil who needs to be overcome, but are sort of lower minions. And some of these characters are defeated point blank. Some of them are rehabilitated. We'll talk more about that in the antagonist lecture. Other people who are around are going to be helpers. So these are, for example, in The Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, those characters are mostly helpers for Frodo. You also have members of the opposition, and these are going to be the antagonist's henchmen, the bad guys with the twirly mustaches. You're also going to have bit players who are one-liners, two-liners, and extras who probably are just adding sort of color and flavor to your world without necessarily having very much to do that is directly related to your screenplay and your screenplay action. Now, it's kind of interesting to take a look at what an audience will know with only one look at a character. And those characteristics are age, sex, physical description, and perhaps a stereotype for a character. Now, this is something where if I showed you a photograph of someone, you could very quickly tell me all of these things about them. So when you introduce a character, these are the things you need to tell about them so that we as a reader of your script can get an idea of what we will be seeing on screen. And these require very little in-depth explanation. Most of these things, a word or sentence will be sufficient. However, there are two things that only action can reveal about a character, and those are their goal and their flaw. And your protagonist and antagonist will have the most fully developed and intense goals and flaws, but many other characters in your screenplay will also have goals and perhaps flaws as well. And so these can only be revealed through what a character does or says. So those you need to show, not tell, when you introduce the characters. So that's just a quick introduction to who's going to populate your screenplay. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about protagonists and how to develop a good and compelling protagonist. And in the lesson after that, we will discuss your antagonist and how to make a delicious bad guy. And in the lesson after that, we'll talk about supporting characters. So I will see you next lesson for a discussion of protagonists. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be discussing your protagonist, your hero. Now, this is your main character, the person whose journey we're following. This is the person we're rooting for. So, what attributes does a protagonist have? Well, there are the obvious ones like age and sex, as well as name, although honestly, in a screenplay, the name is very important for your reader, and we will probably know your protagonist's name by the end of a film, but because you have the visual reference of who you're keeping track of, I'm often amazed how often I get to the end of a movie that I really liked and realize that there are important players whose names I don't know, because I know what they looked like, and that's what I was following. So choosing a name for a screenplay character is not quite as important necessarily as choosing a name for a novel character. But it is an important part. And then you have your age and your sex, which will obviously be very important things for determining who this person is. And every protagonist will have a goal. Now, the goal should be obvious from the very earliest moment in the screenplay. However, it may change and evolve over time, which we'll discuss when we talk about structuring. However, the absolutely most important thing for your protagonist is their flaw. Now, you're maybe thinking, my hero is perfect. No, your hero is not perfect. Watching perfect people is boring. And frankly, if your protagonist were perfect, they would be able to accomplish their goal on page 1 of your screenplay, and then you have no movie. The flaw is what prevents them from accomplishing their goal. All of the struggles and all of the conflicts and all of the obstacles of your screenplay are designed to target your protagonist's flaw. And because they don't know what it is, they are unable to overcome it, and they are thus unable to achieve their goal. So we're rooting for them to realize what their flaw is. So a flaw is some kind of deficiency or lack. It could be a lack of self-confidence. And your audience will be rooting for your character to realize that they lack the self-confidence. And then towards the end of the movie, they will finally realize, I lack self-confidence. If only I had some, I could accomplish my goal. And that's exactly what they do. Realizing their lack of self-confidence allows them to achieve self-confidence and then achieve the goal. So whatever the flaw is, it is realized, overcome, and then the goal is achieved at the end. So the flaw is so important because it is going to directly influence how you structure your story and your plot in the 3-act structure that we'll talk about in a later lesson. So keep thinking about flaws and what flaws will best relate to your theme and the story that you're trying to tell and the character that you're creating in this protagonist. Other important things for you to know, and perhaps for the audience to know, but not necessarily, are the protagonist's backstory. And that is simply the events that have made them who they are today. And depending on the gravity of your story, these could really be on a wide variety of things. It could be traumatic childhood events. It could be what kind of cereal they like to eat for breakfast. And these are all things for you to sort of file away and brainstorm about and sort of create somebody who seems very real. The physical description is fairly important for your protagonist because this is going to influence the kind of person who gets cast in this role and how we see them and how we relate to them. And the world is not fair, and so the way that you choose to describe your protagonist will certainly influence how the audience sees them, what they assume about them, and things like that. So you do need to keep that in mind, and you can use it or subvert it as long as you are aware that it's going to affect the way that we see the character. You may also have an archetype associated with your protagonist, which we'll discuss more in a later lesson. But this is a little bit like choosing sort of a broad category of character for which this person is, and you may or may not find that helpful. We'll discuss this more in the archetype lecture, but that may be something that you want to include in your character notebook as you begin to brainstorm about this protagonist. So, we talked so much about flaws. Let's take a look at some really common protagonist flaws. Now, I already mentioned lack of self-confidence, and that one is certainly a biggie, particularly in movies that are aimed at young adults and teenagers. You'll see that all the time. You will also see lack of self-worth, low self-esteem, and insecurity. Those seem kind of related, but they are subtly different. A lack of self-worth is failing to believe that you are a worthy individual, whereas low self-esteem is more about not feeling like you can do things, you have a lot of agency. And insecurity is more different than those two because it's more about your situation. It's a little less personal. You could be insecure about your living situation or your job, but it's not really about you. So I think that the first two, the lack of self-worth and the low self-esteem, tend to be more common than the insecurity because there's more to overcome personally with those and there's more stakes. You also see naivete a lot, where a character has to sort of grow up and learn how the world works. Inability to put the past behind and inability to face the past, also different. Inability to put the past behind, that would be a character who really dwells on the past, who can't live in the present or imagine a future because they're stuck thinking about the past. An inability to face the past is actually the opposite of that, and something has happened in the past that they can't look at, and so they can't deal with it. So those are subtly different. Inability to trust is often a flaw as well. I think that comes up in a lot of, say, action movies, superhero movies and things like that. Inability to trust is a common flaw like that. Inability to make a commitment, that's a classic flaw for a protagonist for something like a romance or a romantic comedy. And now, after this, when you get into stubbornness and rashness and prejudice, these start to edge on being unsympathetic, and there you have to be careful. You certainly can have a protagonist who has any of these bottom flaws. However, you are going to have to work extra hard to make sure that the audience remains on the character's side and that they don't become completely turned off by an unsympathetic flaw. We want to be rooting for the protagonist throughout. We want to like the protagonist. We want to be hoping that they're going to overcome whatever it is that they need to overcome so that they can accomplish their goal. And somebody who is very prejudiced is going to be a tough sell for a lot of audiences. So there are certainly ways to handle it. And if you think about some of your classic anti-heroes, they definitely have these. Let's take an example from television, Dr. House. Very selfish character, to the point of being an absolute jerk most of the time. And yet, the writers of that show were very careful in every single episode to make him do something that appeared selfless. So even if he managed to explain it away at the end of the episode as being very selfish and coming from a selfish motive, there's the question in the audience's mind of whether or not that's really why he did it, or if it's just his justification so that he can sort of hold up this facade of this grumpy doctor. So those are some of the techniques that you really need to be aware of if you're going to give your protagonist one of these less sympathetic flaws and make them sort of a classic anti-hero. Arrogance, smugness, hubris, and pride all fall into that category as well of you need to be kind of careful about the way that you approach them. However, these bottom ones are great flaws for your antagonist, which we'll talk about in the next lesson. So, supplemental material for this week. You'll have a character flaws handout, a character brainstorming questionnaire, and comprehensive character attribute form. And these are all things for you to use to create this person who you're going to be following for 120 pages. And so the things that go into a character sketch are character attributes that we talked about, some of the backstory, but absolutely no plot. Plot comes later. We're just concerned with the person. So if you find yourself starting to describe things that they're going to do in your story, stop right there. We'll get to that later. This is not the time for that. This is the time to really get inside your character's head and figure out who they are as a person, so that you will be able to write them and figure out what their reactions are to situations. So use the supplemental material, take a look at it, begin brainstorming and creating this person whose journey we're going to follow on. And I will see you in the next lesson for a discussion of antagonists. Hello, and welcome back. Well, now that you've gotten to start describing your protagonist, let's take a look at your antagonist, your bad guy. So, the most important thing to note about the antagonist is that the antagonist mirrors the protagonist. If your antagonist and your protagonist are completely unrelated, it won't be as satisfying in the end when the protagonist manages to overcome the antagonist. Another really important thing that I sometimes struggle with is that the antagonist must be active. If the antagonist is not actively opposing the protagonist, it can get boring and feel a little bit like there aren't enough stakes sustaining the forward motion of your movie plot. If the antagonist is actively working against the protagonist, we always have this sense of impending worry that the antagonist might win. Also, as your protagonist had a flaw, so does your antagonist have a flaw. Now, assuming that you are writing a story in which the protagonist does defeat the antagonist, the protagonist has a flaw which is overcome. The antagonist has a flaw which is not overcome, making it a tragic flaw. And ultimately, while the protagonist puts forward some action that results in the antagonist's defeat at the end of your movie, what really defeats the antagonist is their inability to overcome their flaw. So quite frequently, you will see a setup in which the antagonist has either the same or opposite flaw as the protagonist, because that is just very appealing to an audience. When you watch that happen, you've spent, at that point, 100 minutes rooting for your protagonist. They've overcome their flaw of lack of self-confidence, say, and then you get into the final climactic moment, and your protagonist now has the self-confidence that they can defeat the antagonist, but the antagonist has been overconfident, and their inability to overcome that overconfidence leads to their downfall and defeat. That's very appealing. It's just great cinema. It's great to watch. It's great storytelling. So that's frequently what ends up happening in the climactic moment of Act 3. The antagonist is often disguised at the beginning of a film. You don't necessarily always know in Act 1 who the antagonist is going to be. Sometimes you do. Sometimes you think you have a pretty good idea. You sort of get the cold chills up your spine when you see who you think is going to be the antagonist. The way that they're introduced, the way that they behave around the protagonist could be clues, but you might not find out who it is until later on in the story, particularly for something like a mystery, where you don't necessarily know who the antagonist is until the whodunit is revealed towards the end. But those you have to work very hard, because the antagonist still has to be being active and opposing the protagonist, but the person who it is may be cloaked. A great example of this is Miss Congeniality. The antagonist in that movie, there are many shots of them, but you only see their hands as they work on doing sort of sinister things, making ransom notes and bomb threats, and working with even making what looks like it could be a bomb throughout, but you don't know who they are. Now, it's revealed close to the end, so there's some added tension after a while. However, it's withheld from the majority of the movie, and so that can be a very effective technique. You just can't let the antagonist completely slide out of the story. They have to still be a presence. It may not even be an on-screen presence. It could be, if you were writing a movie about a serial killer, every time a new body turns up, that is an act by the antagonist, even if we don't know who it is. The antagonist could be rehabilitated at the end. They don't necessarily have to be defeated or killed. You should have their defeat be consistent with the stakes of your movie. So if you've had a life and death action movie, the antagonist is most likely going to die at the end. But if you've had something that's very lighthearted, for instance, a comedy about middle schoolers, the antagonist is not going to die at the end of a film like that. They're going to be defeated in some other way, social ostracism or something along those lines. But in terms of rehabilitation, think about romantic comedies. Very frequently in romantic comedies, there are two choices. You either have an antagonist who is an external third party who is trying to keep the couple apart, or more commonly, I think, particularly in modern romantic comedies, one of the lovers is the antagonist for the other one. And if they both go through complete arcs, in some sense, they're both protagonist and antagonist. And so they both have to change and overcome the flaw at the end in order to be together. A classic example of that would be 2 Weeks' Notice. George Wade is the antagonist, and his flaw is the inability to think for himself, but he is rehabilitated at the end of the movie, and they manage to live happily ever after Lucy overcomes her flaw, which is the inability to accept imperfection. You need to make sure that the audience really dislikes your antagonist in the same way that you make sure that they really like your they really like your protagonist. So some tools for creating this dislike are to make them a bully. Nobody likes a bully. You can make the antagonist really self-absorbed. You can make them a liar. And also, appearance may feel like cheating, but it works for a reason. If you think about the classic, evil witch in a Disney movie, you can probably come up with, warts, green skin, ugly, and that will definitely give your viewers a clue that this is not a character that you're necessarily wanting them to sympathize with. However, some of the most interesting antagonists are perhaps a little bit likable, but it's a fine line to walk. So these are some tools that you can use if you feel like your antagonist is not coming off in a way that is bad enough, I suppose. So let's take a look at some examples from some good screenplays. So, Lion King. The antagonist in The Lion King is Scar, and his tragic flaw is overconfidence. And Simba's flaw is lack of self-confidence. So in the climactic moment of that film, it is very rewarding because Simba has overcome his lack of self-confidence, and Scar is defeated by his overconfidence in his position of power and the hyenas. Harry Potter. The antagonist in that story is definitely Voldemort. And Voldemort is a very flawed individual, but I think that his main tragic flaw is hubris. He believes that he cannot be killed. Whereas Harry is a very humble person and is willing to sacrifice himself in order to defeat Voldemort. So again, we have flaws that very much mirror one another. And Harry overcomes his lack of self-confidence in order to defeat Voldemort. Tangled, one of Disney and Pixar's latest hits. Mother Gothel is the antagonist in that story, and she is selfish, and she wants to lock Rapunzel up in the tower and use her power only for herself, and that selfishness is ultimately what defeats her in the end. Avatar, the Colonel, is the antagonist, and he is unable to adapt to change. And so Jake Sully comes to Pandora a very different person than he ends up staying as. And so he adapts to the new situation in a way that the Colonel is not able to, and that is what defeats the Colonel at the end of that movie. So that is a quick introduction to antagonists, and in the next lesson we will get into your supporting characters and how to make them memorable. I'll see you then. Hello, and welcome back. Now that we've talked about your protagonist and your antagonist, we're now going to turn our attention to the other characters who are in your screenplay. So, let's ask the question, who else is there? Well, to begin with, you have the protagonist's allies. You're also going to have pawns of the antagonist. Now, those are fairly self-explanatory. The protagonist's allies are his friends, compatriots, and the pawns of the antagonist are members of the opposition. I'm sure that you can think of many examples of movies protagonists' allies. Lord of the Rings is a great example. Sam is Frodo's ally. The rest of the Fellowship are his allies. Pawns of the antagonist, these are going to be members of the opposition that are more fully developed. Sauron would be an example from Lord of the Rings. You may have a nemesis. Now, the nemesis is an interesting figure because the nemesis is opposing your protagonist at the beginning of the screenplay. They are in the way, and you may even trick your audience into believing that the nemesis is the antagonist. One such example of that would come from Star Wars, where Darth Vader looks like the antagonist for much of the trilogy, but then ultimately it is revealed that the true antagonist is the Emperor, and Darth Vader was only the nemesis. Now, how can you tell these two apart? Well, the nemesis is not the ultimate bad guy. The nemesis also may be rehabilitated at the end, such as with Darth Vader, who sacrifices himself for his son. And so this figure is great to play around with because they can be a very fully developed three-dimensional character in your screenplay, and allow you to provide opposition to your protagonist without having to tip your hand about the antagonist if the antagonist needs to be hidden for some reason, such as in a mystery. You probably will have a well-developed nemesis in a mystery script where the antagonist is not on stage or on screen, as the case may be, for much of the movie. So who else is there? Well, there's going to be the people who populate your world. These are anybody that you would encounter in your daily life. Checkout clerks, people having lunch at cafes where you're setting your scenes, and they deserve different levels of mention depending on how much they're going to play into your story. So you should keep track of these people in your character notebook, where you jot down ideas about who is there, what they are, what function they're serving, and so on. And so I kind of like to keep in mind this character pyramid when I'm coming up with ideas for characters and keeping track of them in my character notebook. Now, the way that this pyramid works is that up at the top you have your protagonist there, and the protagonist needs to have the most details about them. You need to know very, very intimate things about your protagonist and be able to describe them like they're somebody you actually know in your real life. Right underneath that is the antagonist, who requires almost as much detail as your protagonist. The lower you go in the pyramid, the less detail you need to know about these characters. So underneath the antagonist, you have the helpers and the opposition. And so these are sort of the main players who are going to have a lot of screen time. This might be somebody like the protagonist's best friend, the second in command of the antagonist's forces, something like that. Underneath that, you have speaking roles that are bit players. So these are going to be people who probably only have one or two lines. The barista who sells your protagonist her latte, and so on, like that. And so those characters require sort of quick description about how they look, how they sound, something that makes them maybe a little bit unique to keep them from becoming too stereotypical. And then underneath the bit players, you have the extras. And these people have no speaking lines, and they're basically almost like set dressing to the locations that you're describing. And those can usually be gotten away with a very broad description, just simply saying the room is full of people having coffee. Businessmen in suits would be a group of extras that you could describe. You don't need to describe each and every one of them individually, what color tie they're wearing and things like that, because the details are not important and they will fill themselves out, and you'll also find that your reader's imagination will fill them in, and if your script ever gets turned into a real movie, the person who hires the extra will be able to flesh those out. So, how do you make all of these characters memorable? Well, you need to give each one a good introduction. You need to give them something that doesn't completely upstage the scene that you're writing, or the protagonist or the things that are happening in it, but you do need to give them some sort of quick and memorable introduction that could include something unique about them in terms of how they look or how they act. Something that they're doing at the time that we meet them. Something that just sort of makes us remember who they are, so that if you introduce them at the beginning of the scene and they don't speak for a while, when we get halfway through the scene and they do say something, we don't go, wait, who was that? The idea is just to sort of quickly, in a line or two, create a little character sketch of somebody, instead of just introducing them in a very bland way, saying, name of character, age 30, stands in the coffee shop. Give them something. Name of character 30 with purple highlights stands in the coffee shop. We have now associated that character with the purple highlights, and we'll remember that later on. It's also good to give your supporting characters distinctive ways of speaking. If everybody sounds the same in your screenplay, it's not going to be very interesting to listen to. So you certainly sometimes end up working with very regional dialects if you're setting your script in some specific location or time. However, people just naturally, if you listen to your group of friends talk, they're going to use different expressions and different sort of grammatical constructions. And so if you can differentiate your characters by giving them sort of specific styles of speech, you'll go a long way. Also because if somebody is watching your movie, say on television or something like that, and they glance away from the screen and don't necessarily see who speaks, we want them to be able to tell who it was simply by what was said. Also, don't rely too heavily on stereotypes. You can get away with using a stereotype to introduce somebody who is an extra or a bit player. But even with the bit players, I like to sort of challenge myself to keep from falling back on those stereotypes. Now, the power of a stereotype is that in a movie, sometimes you have less than 10 seconds to introduce a character in a memorable way. And in that case, you may simply need to rely on having a fill-in-the-blank stereotype for whatever the situation calls for. But if the bit player is going to have slightly more of a role than simply being the barista who sells the protagonist her latte, who's perhaps going to have a conversation with the protagonist about the relationship that she's having trouble with, it's better to sort of subvert audience expectations and give them something a little bit new and a little bit different, even if it's built on the base of a stereotype. Anything you can do to make your characters three-dimensional will also help out and make your world feel like it's a very real place. This is perhaps slightly more important if you're creating a fantasy world in which we don't know the ground rules or anything about it than it is in a contemporary setting. But even in a contemporary setting, you want to make it feel like this is a place that you could actually go and visit. You want to remind your audience constantly of places that they've been in, situations that they've been in. So any kinds of details that you can pepper out, offhand comments, little quirks about a character that get repeated over time as a real person would, greatly help in making memorable characters. For screenplays, the number one piece of advice that I have to offer, however, is to make sure that there is a reason that this character exists. If there is absolutely no reason for the protagonist to be speaking to this person, cut them. They are irrelevant to the story. And it's very easy to sort of get bogged down in the niceties of daily living in a screenplay. You think, the protagonist goes into the coffee shop to get a latte. Well, you're going to have to exchange some banter with the barista because that's what you would do in real life. However, if that banter that is exchanged is not contributing to the plot or the story that you're telling, it can be cut. And the protagonist can simply walk into the coffee shop and walk out with a latte, and we will fill in the blank for what happened. So just make sure that every single character interaction and every single written dialogue is advancing your plot in some ways. So now let's take a look at some examples from some great screenplays that have really memorable characters. And the first one that I'd like to call out is The Princess Bride. There are so many memorable characters in that. And now think about Vizzini, Inigo Montoya, and Fezzik. They all have very different styles of speech. You could tell in an instant which one was talking simply by what was said, even if you couldn't hear the actor's voice. They are also very different physically from one another, which you could completely capture in the written version of the screenplay, in terms of the way that they were described in their character introduction. And so those characters combine to be incredibly memorable, funny, and touching. Some other great supporting characters would come from The Lion King, Timon and Pumbaa. Again, very different styles of speech. You would never confuse a line of dialogue for Timon for a line of dialogue written for Pumbaa. And also, admittedly, these are animated characters, but again, very physically distinct, and serving very different roles in terms of what their relationship with Simba is. The hyenas are also great examples of some nemesi, I suppose that would be, in a screenplay, that they appear to be working at odds with, or at odds against the protagonist for much of the movie, but at the end, in sort of a backhand way, they actually end up helping out. So that's sort of a good example of something like that. Another movie that has really great supporting characters would be The Fifth Element. Ruby Rhod and the diva are very memorable, again, very different from one another. Three-dimensional. We learn a lot about Ruby Rhod from what he says and doesn't say and his reactions to things. I think that the reactions of Ruby Rhod in that screenplay are really what make that character memorable and distinct. So the next time that you watch a movie, just keep an eye on people who are not the protagonist or the antagonist and see if they're memorable or not. And if they are, can you pinpoint the moment at which you sort of thought, oh, hey, that's a really interesting character? Was it a trait? Was it something in the way that they looked? Was it something that they said? Was it some piece of information you learned about their backstory that made them seem just a little bit more real? These are all good things to keep your eye on and incorporate into your own writing as you begin working on your screenplay. So, mull that over, and I will see you next time. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about archetypes. Now, the question you're probably asking yourself is, what is an archetype? So let's start with a definition. An archetype in Jungian psychology is a collectively inherited unconscious idea, pattern of thought, image, etc., universally present in individual psyches. Now, what does that definition really mean? Well, basically, Jungian psychology says that humans are storytellers, and we always have been and we always will be. And there are stories that we like to tell. Patterns, the hero's journey, things that you see again and again in mythology and every era of storytelling out there. In classic myths, literature, even movies today, we are fascinated by these types of stories and these types of characters. And so that's where the idea of the archetype comes from. An archetype represents fundamentally different types of people and characters. I'm sure that if you think of fairy tales, it's very easy to think immediately of, the damsel in distress, the old crone, Prince Charming. All of these are types of archetypes. And we're not talking about surface differences here. We're talking about deeper, more fundamental things. So this is not the difference between an actress and a librarian, which are sort of stereotypes, but the deeper difference between, say, an Amazon and a nurturer, which are two of the archetypes we'll talk about. So, as they are often confused with stereotypes, why don't we compare and contrast archetypes and stereotypes before delving deeper into our discussion of how to use archetypes? So, a stereotype comes from one person's point of view and usually represents an individual prejudice. It's kind of a limited way of looking at the world. An archetype comes from the entire human race's point of view on people, and there are no judgments or assumptions about the archetype. There is no inherent value placed on one archetype over another. They are simply different types of characters that occur in literature and movies all the time. So stereotypes tend to be limiting because they reduce characters to a collection of surface-level traits. So your librarian is quiet and soft-spoken, but that doesn't really give you a lot to work with, whereas an archetype deepens a character because it reveals hidden fears, hopes, dreams, and motivations. Now, once you identify the type of character, the archetype that your librarian is, suddenly you have a whole world open to you of what she fears, what she hopes for, what she dreams, and what's going to motivate her, which will help you get her from page 1 to page 120 of your screenplay. Now, the information in this lecture comes from a book called 45 Master Characters by Victoria Lynn Schmidt, which I have here. And this is a really interesting book. And if this interests you, I highly recommend looking this up. You can get it on Amazon, and it's a really great description of what an archetype is, how to use it, and also she goes into some more details about the feminine and masculine journeys, which we won't have time to get into here. But if this is something that you think could really help your creative process, I really encourage you to check this out. So let's just begin with sort of hitting the highlights. So Schmidt thinks that the most important questions an archetype will help you answer about your character are the following. What does your character care about? What does your character fear? What motivates your character? And how do other characters view your character? Now, what they care about relates to what they value. And this could be a thing, it could be people, it could be a way of life. Really anything that your character is going to passionately want to defend. And it also relates to the character's goal. And your story conflict should definitely jeopardize what the character cares about and place obstacles in their way that will impede the goal. The fear comes from the character's psychology and backstory. And so it is way more interesting to see a character who is terrified of heights walk out onto a window ledge to rescue someone than it would be to see a tightrope walker walk out onto the same ledge to save someone. So this really gives you an insight into your character and ways to really push them and make them grow. Motivation, each archetype resonates with a different kind of motivator, which drives the character to do things in your story. And so there's sort of 7 basic motivators that actually come from Linda Seeger's Making a Good Script Great, which is another resource that I highly recommend. And so she sort of points to the 7 basic ones as being survival, safety and security, love and belonging, esteem and self-respect, the need to know and understand, the aesthetic, and self-actualization. And both of these books that I've mentioned will give you sort of more information about those if that's something that you're interested in. But then the one that I actually think is the most useful and interesting use of archetypes is to figure out how other characters view that archetype. So some of the things that an archetype will control is how your character chooses to present themselves. So they will end up with a certain look or style, which will influence the way that other characters interact with them and view them. And this will help you start to answer the questions about how other characters are reacting to your character, which is, by definition, what a screenplay is. It is a series of actions and reactions. So your protagonist takes an action, how do the other characters react to that? And archetypes can really make you start thinking about that, and we'll talk more about this in a bit. But first, let's get deeper into what an archetype is. And the way that Schmidt presents them in 45 Master Characters is that each archetype begins with an open-ended character description. And now, when you start reading these, they sound a little bit like horoscopes. They're kind of open-ended, a little bit vague, but they should. You should be able to imagine any person sort of fitting into this idea and this mold. And it will help guide you if you get stuck with your character. Then she provides the answers to the 4 questions about what the character cares about, what they fear, what motivates them, and how other people see them. So those are sort of the core of what defines this archetype. But this is a thing that I actually find to be incredibly useful, is that Schmidt also gives suggestions for other archetypes for other characters to pair with your protagonist to help them grow. And this is what I usually use archetypes for, is that if I get stuck and I'm not sure what to do with a character, I'll go through and sort of find the section that most closely mirrors the character that I've created and see who else I can throw in with them to make them grow or learn. So that is a section that I find very useful. And also, it is worth noting that all of these archetypes could also be in the form of the antagonist instead of the protagonist. And so Schmidt will give an open-ended example of what that looks like as well for each of these. So the bulk of each section on each archetype is devoted to what a protagonist would be like. However, there is a section at the end that also talks about what an antagonist would be like if you chose that for your other characters. So let's take a look at an example of one archetype that I think is useful and we see a lot in movies these days, and that is the Amazon. And so I will just begin by reading you some of Schmidt's example character descriptions here. So, she says, "The Amazon is a feminist. She cares more about the female cause than she cares for her own safety. She wouldn't hesitate to come to the aid of another woman or child no matter what the risk is to herself. Her masculine side is just as strong as her feminine side, which sometimes leaves her confused about where she fits in with others. She is a wild woman who spends as much time in nature as possible. She's never happy living in the city for long and may become frustrated with her life until she discovers her true passion for the outdoors. She is intuitive, instinctual, and loves to travel and explore exotic places. Rose in Titanic is a caged Amazon. So that's just a little bit of a sample of the kinds of things that you will find in this book. To answer the question what the Amazon cares about, she cares about the feminine, nature, and the earth. She cares about looking after women and children and protecting them because she believes that everyone deserves to be free and independent. She is also very into competitive sports because she absolutely must win. Winning is always her goal. What she fears is being vulnerable and losing. With the obsession with winning, losing by definition attacks that, and so that is one of her greatest fears. She also fears having her freedom and independence taken away and would often rather die than see that happen. She is motivated by survival and getting behind a cause that she believes in. Any kind of environmental activist could be seen as being an Amazon character. And she also cares about saving another woman's life. So we might see somebody like Wonder Woman here. How others react to this character and how they see her. She isn't fashionable and doesn't think too much about her clothing. She's not going to be a girly girl. She's not going to spend hours picking out coordinating clothing and makeup. Her athleticism is simultaneously alluring and intimidating, and she may come off as cold and absorbed in her own tasks. So, for interesting results, pair her with the protector, who could teach her to trust others and allow others to help her. The fool could teach her about fun and adventure and how to lighten up. The nurturer could teach her the value of being a mother and protecting something else. Some classic examples from television and film would be Buffy from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I think probably the most classic would be Xena from Xena Warrior Princess. We've also mentioned Rose in Titanic. Ellen Ripley in Alien would be a great example of this archetype. But Gracie Hart is also an example of the Amazon in Miss Congeniality. Now that one may seem a little bit odd at first because that's definitely a comedy. These others are all fairly serious. But the Amazon archetype describes her. She is somebody who is passionate about protecting others and wants to stand up for herself and be free and independent, and she is forced into a situation that attacks all of that. She doesn't know anything about hair, makeup, clothing, and yet she's forced to compete in a beauty pageant in order to uphold her other goals. So that's a great example of taking an archetype and putting them in a situation that attacks all of their fears. So, how do you choose an archetype that is right for what story you're telling and what character you have? Well, you need to pick an archetype who will be challenged the most by the obstacles and conflict in your story. If the character in Miss Congeniality had been similar to, say, Elle Woods from Legally Blonde, there would have been no conflict because she would have loved every minute of competing in the beauty pageant. As it is, Gracie Hart hates it and is just trying to do her job. So there's a lot of conflict there. And also, you need to pick an archetype that has room to grow in your story. Gracie Hart learns a lot from being in that beauty pageant, and in fact delivers a very moving speech at the end about all of the things that she has learned from it. So you need to keep that in mind too, that you need to pick an archetype that will be challenged and grow by the story that you're telling. And also, get creative. Just because you chose an archetype like Amazon doesn't mean the character has to be in the military, as we saw in Miss Congeniality. Another example of a character who could be an Amazon and not in the military would be a scientist fighting to get an experimental drug approved. It's a cause that they passionately believe in and they're willing to fight for, but it's a situation that is very different from what you might expect, stereotypically, out of that character. If you've already written a story and you're not starting from scratch, and you're trying to perhaps jazz up a character in a rewrite or add some dimension to your protagonist or one of the supporting characters, here are some questions to ask yourself in order to figure out which archetype they fit best. So you can ask things like, is my character introverted or extroverted? Does she solve problems using instincts, logical thinking, or emotion? How does she feel about her appearance? How does she think about family and children? How does she feel about her sexuality? What types of friends does she have? What does she consider to be fun? These and more questions you will find in 45 Master Characters, and so if this is something that you think is interesting, I definitely, again, suggest checking that out. And these are great things to ask yourself if you're working on a rewrite, or even at the beginning as you're planning your character. One thing that often comes up is combining archetypes, and people will ask, can a character be more than one archetype? And the answer is yes and no. A character can certainly have characteristics from more than one archetype, and in fact, many of us do. However, one should dominate. At all of the important moments in your screenplay, the character should be reacting consistently as one archetype. And there are some characteristics that are simply going to conflict. For example, a character who passionately does not like children is not going to want to support a daycare. So there are some things that you just will have difficulty combining, but people are three-dimensional and conflicting, and so you can certainly bring in elements of multiple archetypes. But to make your character seem as real as possible, their reactions and their actions should be consistent with one type, so that as you begin to structure your story, one archetype is controlling the way that the character moves through the journey that you've given them. If you switch in the middle, it'll feel muddled. So definitely, pull what you can and be creative, but just keep in mind that you need to sort of have one dominate. So if this is something that you think is interesting, try this test drive if you have this book. Choose 3 archetypes and write a 1 or 2 page long synopsis of your screenplay using that archetype for your protagonist. Now, they're probably going to be quite different, depending on how different the archetypes that you choose are. And you will find that there will be many different plot details that emerge as a result of the individual fears and goals of each archetype within the confines of your story. You may find that one completely doesn't work and another is exactly the way that you hoped it would be. But by choosing 3, you sort of get a picture of all of the different ways that your story could go, and one of them will certainly resonate with you and work best. So, I will leave you with that. I find that archetypes are a very useful guide when I'm stuck. I admit that I don't usually begin by using archetypes to create my characters because my characters tend to precede my plot. However, I have definitely used these when I'm stuck. I have a character who's falling flat and I can't figure out what to do with them. I definitely will pull this book out and flip through it. There are 45 to choose from, some for men, some for women, some for supporting characters, and it really can help get you thinking. I also had a story one time where I had a very compelling protagonist and wanted to give them a love interest and couldn't figure out interesting characteristics for the love interest to have that would push their buttons, so I went to this book and I flipped to the archetype of my protagonist and saw what interesting pairs of other archetypes could be given to other characters around them, and used one of those to pattern the love interest, which made the story come alive because all of a sudden he was doing things that absolutely pushed her buttons and really added an interesting dynamic that otherwise I probably would never have found. So try this test drive out if this is something that you think will work for you, and I look forward to seeing you in our next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the discussion of archetypes. Now we're going to turn our attention towards the hero's journey, which is something that if you ever watch director's commentary, producer's commentary, you've probably heard come up in reference to movies before. So, Joseph Campbell was a scholar of comparative mythology and comparative religion, and he published The Hero with a Thousand Faces in 1949, which is arguably his most important work and most famous work, although he published many, many other essays about these topics and about the monomyth. And that was sort of his big idea, was this idea of there being a collective story that we like to tell one another. Now, the hero's journey came out of this idea of the monomyth and is built on a foundation of Freudian and Jungian psychology, which were very in vogue in the early half of the 20th century. And so a lot of the ideas that come into play are the idea of the unconscious and the collective unconscious, this idea that there are things within our psyche that we are unaware of, and perhaps there are things within our cultural psyche which are also sort of buried below the surface level of our awareness. Also a fair amount of dream analysis and what dreams mean crept into the ideas behind this monomyth and the applicability of it across cultures. So one of his quotes is, "Dream is the personalized myth, myth is the depersonalized dream." And both are symbolic of the dynamics of the psyche. This idea that your psyche knows something that you don't. and that it's tapping into these larger ideas that are the myths and giving you these dreams, and that the myths come out of these individualized dreams in a sort of generalized form. The cyclical nature of all of these things is very present in the hero's journey. And in fact, the hero's journey is conceptualized of cycles. It's leaving and returning. It's passing from the known to the unknown and back again. So that leads us to the question, who is a hero? And according to this framework, the usual hero is either someone who has something taken from them, or someone who feels something is lacking in the experiences they are permitted to have. So somebody who feels that they have to leave their homeland or their community to get something that's missing from their life. All right, so the monomyth is sort of a universal storytelling pattern. It's the common essence of heroic stories. Anytime you have a hero who is journeying to do something, accomplish something, bring something back, you see the same things come up again and again and again. And the brilliant thing is that this is applicable to stories from every single culture. And if you read A Hero with 1,000 Faces, the text is absolutely littered with references to myths from all different cultures, Western cultures, Chinese cultures, Asian cultures in general. There's a significant amount of Greek mythology in there. And it really does seem like there are these ideas that keep coming up again and again and again. Now, Joseph Campbell devoted his whole life to studying these and these different mythologies and comparing what elements came up frequently and in somewhat of a pattern. And so he breaks the monomyth into 3 basic phases. There's separation, initiation, and return. Now, separation, the hero leaves the normal and real world and enters a world of extraordinary and supernatural things. Now, when Joseph Campbell talks about these stages, it's very mythical and supernatural because he's dealing with stories of gods and goddesses frequently. So when we apply this to sort of modern stories, we have to treat them a little bit like metaphors, where you may be writing a story that is set in contemporary New York and there is no fantasy realm. However, in that case, you're putting your protagonist and your hero in a situation that is outside their normal experience. So it is a bit of an extraordinary world for them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The second stage is initiation. The hero faces intense opposition and then a decisive victory is won. And that sounds an awful lot like Act 2 leading up to the climax in Act 3 of traditional story structure, which we'll get to in the next chunk of lessons. Finally, the third section here is the return. The hero returns from his adventure a changed person and is able to benefit others as a result of the journey. So, a classic example of this would be Prometheus, who ascends to the heavens, entering the supernatural world, steals fire from the gods, and then returns to the earth and gives fire to mankind. Now that's a classic mythological example from this, but you see this story everywhere, in the story of the Buddha, Christianity, Moses. So in the following slides, I'm going to present sort of a stripped down version of this hero's journey. And I'm going to remove a lot of the psychology and mythology that Joseph Campbell uses to describe the terms, and I'm going to the best of my abilities use modern examples of these different elements because that's probably what we're going to be working with. However, if this is something that you think is interesting, I highly recommend checking out Hero with 1,000 Faces. It's a very interesting read, and you will hear it talked about a lot, but it is not a screenwriting text by any means. It's a philosophy text. But without further ado, let's dive into our first section, which is separation or departure. So the first thing that happens is that there is a call to adventure. Destiny summons the hero. And the adventure can be anything beyond the ordinary for the character. And this could also be by the hero's choice or forced upon the hero. So if you have a reluctant hero, probably something is going to happen to them that forces them to leave their normal life and take up this adventure. If you have somebody who is yearning for adventure, they're going to jump at the chance. So this could begin really in a number of ways, including a blunder by the hero that changes the path their life is going to follow. It could also involve an awakening of the self, realizing that something is missing and you have to go seek and find it. An example of this would be My Best Friend's Wedding. In this, she literally receives a call to adventure because in the first 15 minutes of the script, she gets a call from her best friend, who she thinks might be proposing but is actually inviting her to his wedding. So that's a literal call to adventure, but it could come in any kind of form. The next thing that may happen is a refusal of the call, and this happens when the hero says no to the journey. Opportunity knocks, and the hero turns it down. Eventually, the hero will have to say yes, or the story will never happen, and a great example of this would be Bilbo Baggins in The Hobbit. Gandalf comes and tells him that he's going to go set him up on this great adventure, and he says, no thank you, I'm staying here in Hobbiton and the Shire where I'm comfortable, but he reconsiders at the last moment and joins them and sets off on the journey. Which leads us to, mentioning Gandalf, supernatural aid. Someone must offer the hero protection and guidance. So in The Hobbit, it's certainly Gandalf. But this could be anybody. A guide, ferryman, teacher, fairy godmother, very traditional examples of this. So Obi-Wan Kenobi from Star Wars, Mr. Keating from the Dead Poets Society are all figures who offer aid. And now you can see that Mr. Keating is certainly not supernatural, but he is the guide and teacher and educator, and he is who is shepherding the students along their path at the beginning of the movie. The hero may also have a talisman that offers strength, power, or protection. An example might be something from, say, Star Wars. A lightsaber is sort of a form of a talisman. In The Lord of the Rings, the ring is certainly a talisman, albeit in that case a sort of dangerous one. But these are all sort of things that get into play early on in the movie or the story that you're telling. The other really important one is crossing the threshold. And here the hero leaves behind the world they know and enters the unknown. They may encounter a guardian that they have to pass, and beyond that guardian is darkness and mystery. The guardian is there to prevent those who are not ready for the journey from beginning. So examples of this, again from The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, Bilbo and Frodo have to leave the Shire to go on their adventure. In The Wedding Date, Kat flies to England for her sister's wedding, leaving New York behind. So that one's a little bit less profound, perhaps. In Evita, Eva leaves behind her sleepy little town to go to Buenos Aires, the big city. So all of these are sort of moments of change for the character, where they are giving up a place that they know or a condition that they know and are leaving and embracing the journey. And this is sort of the point of no return, that once you do this, you can't really go back. The idea of the belly of the whale is sort of related to crossing the threshold, because in this element, the hero is swallowed by the unknown as if they had died. And so this may be a symbolic or literal death. In most cases in modern cinema, it's probably going to be more symbolic. So like Catch Me If You Can. Frank sheds his former identity and adopts numerous new ones as he embarks on his adventure. Similarly, Evita, Eva reinvents herself in Buenos Aires, leaving behind, the girl that she once was, to be this movie star, actress, and politician. And so this idea is very interesting to play around with, that your hero must in some way change themselves. I'm sure that there are some literal examples of people who fake their own death at this stage because they are afraid of being followed by friends or family. But this idea that there's something that's undoable about this, that they are fully embarked upon their adventure and they are now enmeshed in the unknown and there's no going back. Okay, this leads us to the idea of initiation. And this is the question, really, that your entire movie and story is asking. And it is this person worthy of being considered a hero? And everything you put them through in the middle chunk of your screenplay, Act 2, what we'll call the struggle in later structure lessons, is answering this question. It is putting them in dire situations in which they absolutely must prove themselves. And the journey that the hero is on usually follows one of two paths. It is either a physical deed or a spiritual deed that the hero must accomplish. And that directly ties into what their goal is along the path of the journey. So now, in the next chunk, the struggles and trials chunk of the hero's journey, not every single one of these will occur in every single story, but there are different patterns that emerge, and each story probably has a few of these. So I'm going to sort of quickly present some of the more common patterns that you see that I've noticed in modern screenwriting especially. And the first one is the dragon battle. And in this, the hero must battle either an external foe or an internal demon. And that's basically every story ever told, that the opposition must be slain before the journey can continue. The protagonist or the hero must overcome a flaw before they can get to the climax, before they can defeat the antagonist. They must get through literal obstacles throughout the struggle in order to get there. So, next would be meeting with the goddess. And in this, a powerful woman offers wisdom or supernatural aid. And an example that jumped to the top of my head was Galadriel in Lord of the Rings. Next up, we have the brother battle. The hero must oppose someone close to them. The brother figure could be literal or figurative. For a literal example, Thor and Loki in the Avengers. For a more figurative example, think of Peter Parker and Harry Osborn in Spider-Man 3. Next, we have atonement with the father. This one's very classic. The hero must come to terms with their father or father figure before they can assume their rightful place in the world or their community. This often provides motivation to begin a journey, and it is often a stepping stone along a larger journey. So, right off the top of my head, Field of Dreams is a classic example of having to come to terms with a distant father. You also see this crop up in kids' movies all the time. So, Treasure Planet, Jim Hawkins must get over his father's abandonment of the family, and just when he's found a new father figure in the cyborg double-crosses him, and he has to come to terms with that as well, and perhaps show that he's learned something from the first time he overcame issues with his father. Also, How to Train Your Dragon. Hiccup has to learn how to talk to his father before he can take his proper place as a leader of their village, albeit a slightly non-traditional one. So this one you see all of the time. Sacred marriage, I think, also comes up very often, and in this the hero has a special connection with another character in the screenplay. It could be romantic, but it doesn't have to be, and it provides motivation when everyone else thinks that all is lost. From a television example, Penny and Desmond from Lost. Penny believes that Desmond is alive against all odds and continues to search for him. In Lord of the Rings, Aragorn and Arwen, he thinks that she's dead, but this motivates him to confront Sauron, which spurs the sort of climactic moment of that third movie. For ritual death, this is putting the old life behind, and again, this is sort of tied into those ideas of like having to shed a former existence, so Catch Me If You Can. In some way, you could sort of consider The Mask of Zorro to be a good example of this as well. Actually, both Zorros, in some ways, have given up their former existence. The original Zorro must give up being Zorro to pass it on to a new Zorro, and the new Zorro has to give up his previous life to adopt this persona and do good. Apotheosis is being raised to the status of a god and worshipped, and this is pretty literal a lot of the time, and it's usually after completing a difficult or dangerous task. Again, kids' movies here, Hercules, quite literally, he is raised to a god, although he has some interesting results after that. The Road to El Dorado is one of my favorite examples because it takes this one and turns it on its head a little bit, that their difficult and dangerous task was accomplished almost by accident as they struggle to find El Dorado, and then they are basically accidentally worshipped as gods. And so that occurs very early on in their struggle and actually becomes the basis of many of their future struggles. So Tulio and Miguel, very funny movie. The ultimate boon. The hero brings back a boon or elixir that fixes the problem that originally started the journey. This would be a Grail-type plot if they actually managed to find the Grail, or whatever it was that they were seeking. Harry Potter 7 and 8 would be great examples of this. In the search for the Horcruxes, they need the Horcruxes in order to defeat Voldemort, and so bringing back a Horcrux fulfills sort of this idea of bringing back something that fixes the problem. And another example is Miss Congeniality. Her goal is to catch the killer, catch the bomb threat. And so by doing that, the object that she's obtaining is in fact this person, this criminal. And once she has that criminal, she fixes the problem because they can no longer be a threat to the beauty pageant. And she can bring them to justice. Alright, so that ends the second section and brings us up to the third, which is return and reintegration. And now return fulfills the monomyth idea of the cyclical nature of the journey and the doing good for others. So the first kind of classic one here is refusal of the return. The hero does not want to go back. The adventure isn't over. They're not willing to let it go. And even here, the Buddha, he questioned whether or not his enlightenment could actually be communicated to others and almost didn't want to try. And so this is sort of a final trial for your hero, where they have gotten through their journey, you think, and then at the very last moment, they like where they are. They've sort of done all this stuff, and maybe they feel a little bit resentful, like, why should I go back and help everybody else who wasn't here? But a successful hero overcomes that and does in fact return to bring their knowledge, wisdom, or whatever object it was that they obtained back to their home. In terms of how the hero gets back, there are sort of two paths in the magic flight of how the hero returns. The hero is either explicitly commanded to return after winning the blessing of the gods. In an example of that would be sort of the fifth element, where Corbin is told he can return to Earth after he finishes his mission. Or, with more action involved, the hero has stolen something and their return is being impeded. There are obstacles in the way and the hero has to fight to get home. Catch Me If You Can is a great example of that, because Frank wants to go home, but Carl Hanratty won't let him. And so he has to struggle against that in order to make it back to his home. Another thing that often happens is rescue from without, where the world comes to get the hero. And as I will mention in the story structuring lessons that follow this, you want to be very careful that this does not occur in the climax. You want the hero to directly overcome the antagonist, but along the way this could happen, where you have rescue from without. And this is when someone else rescues the hero so that the journey can be finished. Sort of imagine, your track runner picking up a fallen teammate and helping them cross the finish line. That's this pattern. A lot of times sacrifice also sort of fits into this, where somebody will sacrifice themselves so that the hero can continue on. Gandalf, Obi-Wan again. Very frequently I found it is often that teacher or mentor figure which cuts off the protagonist from their source of support and makes things more dire. Although when it happens later on in the screenplay, it's less likely to be that character. Crossing of the return threshold. The hero returns to where he came from. And this, the hero must re-accept the real and normal after experiencing the fantastic and extraordinary. So this is when Frodo comes back to the Shire. This is when Bilbo comes back to the Shire. At the end of Lost in Translation, Bob Harris returns to America. The end of The Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman. Lyra and Will have to return to their worlds as well. Corbin and Leeloo return to Earth at the end of The Fifth Element. And they have to sort of give up this extraordinary journey and this extraordinary experience that they have had and move on and reintegrate with their former life. So, if any of this sort of piqued your interest or struck your fancy, I do highly recommend checking out Hero with 1,000 Faces. You can find it on Amazon.com, and if you check the supplemental material for this week, you will find a link to it. However, you definitely need to be in the mood for a philosophy book if you're going to do this, because while this is used by screenwriters all the time, this is not a book about screenwriting. But it is very interesting, and if mythology is something that you are interested in, you will find a multitude of examples of all of these different elements and more that I have presented for you here. So, this week's test drive, what I would like you to do is choose a movie you've seen recently and jot down elements from the hero's journey that were present in the film. But remember that unless the movie was fantasy, the elements are probably not literally present, and you're going to have to treat them a little bit more like metaphors as you approach what was there. Was there a figure who stood in as a godlike person, somebody who was in power and in control? In terms of crossing the threshold, they may not actually have changed places, but did they get a promotion, which put them in an upper echelon of the company, changing their status? Look for things like that. I find this to be helpful in analyzing movies more than in actually creating my own, but if it's something where you begin to see patterns that you really like, jot those down in your notes as you begin developing your story idea. And with that, I will conclude, and I will see you in the next section of lessons for a discussion of story structure and story structuring techniques. I'll see you then. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to look at log lines, which are sort of the cornerstone of screenplay pitches and ideas. So let's begin by asking the question, what is a log line? A log line is a 1 to 2 sentence description of your story, and should ideally be 60 words or less. And in fact, many times online, if you're submitting your screenplay for a contest, they will require it to be 60 words or less. Now, that seems like a pretty tall order to condense your entire screenplay down into 1 or 2 sentences of only 60 words. And yet, this is something that can make or break your pitch of your story. A good log line can definitely open doors for you. So, let's talk about what should be in a log line. Well, number 1, you need a description of your protagonist. Number 2, you need the conflict in your story. And number 3, you need the thing it is that your protagonist must do. So here are some examples of creating a log line. So let's say protagonist. An example of this would be a Kansas farm girl who longs for adventure. We have who she is and what she wants. The conflict in the story. She is transported to a world where she's transported to a world she's only dreamed of. And now we have what that protagonist must do. But she must discover that sometimes there's no place like home. Put it together, and here's what you get. A Kansas farm girl who longs for adventure is transported to a world she's only dreamed of, but must discover that sometimes there's no place like home. Sounding familiar yet? Well, it's The Wizard of Oz. So, what else should a logline do? Well, Blake Snyder thinks that a logline should consist of 4 elements: irony, compelling mental picture, audience and cost, which are implied, and a good title, which gives it the 1-2 punch. And this is from his book, Save the Cat. And so our logline was pretty solid for The Wizard of Oz, but perhaps to jazz things up and make it a little bit more visually interesting, we can add a few more descriptors to sort of capture that Technicolor world that we all know and love. So here's a revised logline for this movie. A Kansas farm girl who longs for adventure is transported by cyclone to a Technicolor world she's only dreamed of, but must discover that sometimes there's no place like home. Now, that's a pretty solid logline because we've got a compelling mental image, we've got our character introduction, we have some irony in there as well, because we have this Kansas farm girl longing for adventure, only to be taken to a world where she can have it, who discovers that actually, perhaps there's no place like home. That's fairly ironic. We also have implied audience and cost. This is going to be, today it would be very cheap to make, but at the time you're going to be dealing with color film, and so that would perhaps indicate that it would be a little bit pricier. However, it's going to have a very broad appeal. This is a very all-American sounding girl, so it's going to appeal to a very all-American audience from a wide variety of backgrounds. Alright, so those are all of the things that a logline should do. What should not be in a logline? Your protagonist's name should not be in your logline. The people who read these loglines read hundreds a day, and they just can't keep track of every Jane and every John in every logline. And so you need to come up with a way to describe your protagonist in a way that is much easier for them to grab onto. So we have a Kansas farm girl instead of Dorothy. You should also not include explicit plot details. You need to include the conflict, but we don't need to know every step along the journey that the protagonist is going to take, because it will get quickly very confusing. This logline is designed to paint a very broad picture. We sort of want who we're following, what kind of journey we're following them on, and what the take-home message is that the protagonist learns. That's how to create a great logline. Now, lest you be concerned that nobody will ever find out the wonderful details of your screenplay, this is coupled with the pitch. And the pitch is a little bit longer, although it's still very short. It's about a paragraph. And this is a description of your idea that is designed to make people say, wow, I want to see that movie. So this needs to include the protagonist, antagonist, main conflict, and the protagonist's arc. So it's got a lot of the same elements as the logline, but a little bit more expanded. You're still not including names or too many details. So here's an example of a pitch for The Wizard of Oz. A Kansas farm girl longs for a place where dreams can come true. A cyclone uproots her and deposits her in the middle of a technicolor land, and she believes she's found paradise, until a wicked witch blames her for the death of her sister. The girl begins a journey to seek out the greatest wizard in the land to help her defeat the witch. Along the way, she meets strange and wonderful new friends, each who needs something from the wizard. But on their journey, they discover that maybe they already had everything they needed. There we've got a beginning, a middle, and an end. We have a protagonist and an antagonist. We've also managed to allude to the protagonist's helpers. And we have a journey for them, that they're on a literal journey trying to find this great wizard, but along the way discover that he wasn't what they needed to help them. They already had it in their power. So that's the pitch. That's designed to make people say, yeah, that sounds like a great movie. You know, I'm interested, I want to hear more. So when you're pitching your idea, there are three parts: the title, the logline, and then the pitch. You want to keep it short, you want to keep it upbeat, and really sell your idea. If you're excited, your audience will be excited. I really recommend practicing this on your friends as you begin to work on your idea. And this is a great time to begin refining the idea and focusing it in. You may think that it's a little bit counterintuitive of us to be beginning with a logline when you think that, wow, you know, I haven't really even figured out what my story is about yet. Well, this is the time to do it. I must tell you from personal experience that it is so much easier at this stage in the game to make huge sweeping changes to your idea as you begin to refine the pitch and the logline. Once you have an outline set and you've begun writing, it becomes much more challenging to admit to yourself that something's not working or something could be better if you took it in a different direction. This is definitely the time where you want to nail things down and figure out what people are interested in, what you're interested in, and how it's all working together. So in this week's supplemental material, you'll find a test drive for a logline and pitch exercise, and also a little description of the pitch game, which is something that I like to play with my friends when we're sitting around and trying to decide what movie we're going to watch for the evening. And it's basically exactly that, where our job is to pitch films to each other, and whoever has the best pitch essentially wins, because that's the movie that we end up watching. It's a really great exercise because coming up with a succinct logline and pitch for a story is very challenging, and you need practice doing it. And probably the first pitch you write will be an entire page, and you have to start whittling down and whittling down and whittling down until you only get the details that are absolutely necessary and most compelling. So this is something that you can just do with your friends if they're game. Pick 3 movies, come up with a logline and a quick pitch for each one of them, and see which one your friends pick. And then you'll know what elements were most attractive to them. At any rate, in the next lesson, we're going to take a look at writing your synopsis, which is a somewhat longer, about a page, description of your story with some more details in it. So, enjoy the test drive, and I will see you in the next lesson for a discussion of synopses. See you then. Hello, and welcome back. Now that you have your logline and pitch refined, it's time to turn your attention towards your synopsis, which is a longer description of your entire story. It's about a page long, which works out to be about 450 words, double-spaced that is. So, what should be in a synopsis? Well, you're going to have your protagonist, this time they can be named, and your antagonist, also named. There's room in the synopsis for one other named character who is important. For example, a love interest would be a character who could be named. If you have more important characters than that, you should really try and figure out ways to describe them that don't involve throwing out too many names. You may be able to get away with a fourth, but if you start putting in too many proper nouns, it'll get confusing for your reader to follow all of the logic in your synopsis, and you really want them focusing on the idea at this point and the general character sketch instead of the specifics. You're also going to include the beginning, middle, and end. Yes, you must include the end. You absolutely have to give away the ending of your story, otherwise it is incomplete, and we don't know whether or not the payoff will be earned or not. So what should not be in a synopsis? You should not include every plot twist and turn. So if you have many subplots in your screenplay, you need to focus on the main plot and exclude the ones that are not quite as important. If your main plot is selling it well enough, we'll get to your subplots later, and they'll certainly add lots to your story. But right now, we really need to focus on the main journey of the protagonist through their beginning, middle, and end. You want to keep it streamlined and definitely hit the highlights. Lots and lots of details can be excluded from this absolutely with no problem. So, this is a pretty tall order, and I have to admit that this is one of my least favorite things about screenwriting, is coming down and sitting down and coming up with a way to describe a story that you have spent at that point weeks or months working on and fleshing out, and you know all of these details and information about what's important and how this little one-sentence piece of dialogue in Act 1 comes back in Act 3 and it's beautiful and you love it. How do you condense that down? Well, I have to give credit here to Susan Dennard, because I found her blog post at publishingcrawl.com, and this was a huge light bulb moment for me. So I am about to present to you the 11 key elements of a great synopsis that come from her post at Publishing Crawl. I really encourage you to check out this post. She has a great example of a synopsis she's written for Star Wars. I've written one for Harry Potter that you will find in this lesson supplemental material. But really check out her post. It was a huge light bulb moment for me. So let's take a look at the 11 key elements. So here they are, and we'll delve into each one in a little bit more detail. So let's begin with the first one, the opening image. Now, this is a place, image, or idea that sets up what's going to happen in the rest of the story. It can set tone, it can set place, it can give us a clue whether we're in the present, the past, the distant future. If there's something that's going to be very important thematically throughout and return throughout the screenplay, this is a place to put it. So that's your opening image, which is followed immediately by the protagonist's introduction. And the opening image should probably be about a sentence long, and the protagonist's introduction should also be a sentence or two. So this answers the question of who are we going to be following in the story, what are they like, and most importantly, what do they want? That's the key one here, because what they want is going to be related to their goal, which is going to shape the rest of what's to come. The next thing is the inciting incident, and this is what makes your character take action. This is what kicks off your story, and this will be actually straight out of your outline once we get there. And this is a moment that is out of the ordinary, in which the protagonist does something, or something happens to them, that kicks off the beginning of our tale. Followed by plot point 1. And this is the most important thing that happens in Act 1, and is probably, but not necessarily, the first turning point, which we will also talk about in the structure lessons. Then we have conflicts and character encounters. And this is just sort of your chance to quickly sum up what's going on with your protagonist right now. And these will be coming out of the beginning of Act 2. So what's going on with your protagonist? Who are they meeting? How are they living? How do they meet or react to the antagonist? At this point, this is where the antagonist is probably going to enter your tale if they have not already. And then we sort of get to the middle of the synopsis, which is, appropriately enough, the midpoint. Again, this is straight out of the outline, and this is the middle of the movie. A line is crossed, and there is no going back. This moment is very pivotal in terms of the emotional state of your protagonist, and we will discuss this in much more detail again in the structure lessons. Then 7. This is where it seems like the protagonist is about to win, but something happens. Something happens and everything goes wrong. The antagonist is able to defeat the protagonist in this moment. Something goes amiss, which leads us to 8, the black moment. and this is where your character is as low as they can go. And this moment immediately precedes the character's epiphany, in which they realize what their character flaw is, which will allow them to create a plan that gets us to 9, the climax. And here, your protagonist does something that defeats the antagonist. Again, moment of highest tension. This can probably be summed up in a couple of sentences, which leads us then to the resolution, which is how things get wrapped up. Do people live happily ever after? If not, how do they feel about it? And then, just as we began with an opening image, we end with a final image. And this is the last thought or image you want to leave your viewer with. How does the protagonist feel about the journey they've had? Are they hopeful for the future, ready to move on? So, if you use these 11 elements as you begin to write your synopsis, you will hit upon many of the important structural elements that we'll get into when we talk about structuring your screenplay in the 4-act and 3-act structure lectures which follow. So this week's supplemental material, there is the synopsis worksheet, as well as a synopsis handout in which I use those 11 elements to write a synopsis of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone to give you a feel for about how long each of those elements ought to be. Some of them are only a sentence, some are a short paragraph, but again, you're shooting for about 450 words. So, begin to work on those with your own story idea, and chances are you'll be bouncing back and forth between your synopsis, your logline, and your pitch for a while, sort of getting things honed in correctly, which will make things much easier for you when we start talking about your outline at the end of this section. So, I will see you next time. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, I'm going to introduce you to the topic of story structure. Now, when I say story structure, the first objection that inevitably gets raised is somebody cries, formulaic. They say, no, I am not going to use the story structuring techniques. I am going to be original and write something that has never been done before. Well, chances are you can't actually write something that's never been done before because, as the adage goes, there's nothing new under the sun. But also, story structure is not designed to be formulaic. It is not as though you sit down with the story structure template and crank out identical screenplays. In fact, story structure is a template for you to use to enhance your creativity and come up with something that is even more original than you might have if you just sat down and began typing. So, what does story structure do for you? Well, one that is perhaps the most important is that it keeps your writing on track, and it makes sure you know where you're going. It is very disheartening to get bogged down in the middle of Act 2 and have absolutely no idea what comes next. This frequently happens right around the 30-minute mark, actually. Writers will come up with a brilliant idea, they'll have all of this inspiration, and they'll sit down and begin writing Act 1, and they will construct a beautiful, wonderful, emotionally satisfying Act 1, get to the first turning point, and have absolutely no idea what comes next. And at that point, instead of sitting down and trying to figure it out, those 30 pages end up languishing in a drawer someplace. So, by beginning with structure, you avoid that problem because then as you start writing, you know exactly where you're going and how you're going to get there. And structure also makes sure that the story you're telling connects emotionally with your viewers, which is the most important thing, arguably, that a good storyteller can do. But wait. What about movies like Pulp Fiction, Run Lola Run, or Magnolia? Those don't seem like they follow traditional story structuring techniques at all. Pulp Fiction, in fact, is told sort of almost in concentric circles. But I will say that if you begin to look at where traditional story structuring moments should fall, chances are that at the appropriate time in the movie, there are corresponding emotional highs and lows, as well as plot twists and turns, even though the story is being told chronologically out of order. Run Lola Run is a very interesting German film. It's an 80-minute piece that is broken up into 3 chunks in which the character Lola performs essentially the same action 3 times. Once when she's early, once when she's late, and once when she's right on time. And the ending plays out quite differently in each case, depending on her timing. Now, that certainly does not seem like that fits traditional story structuring at all. However, each individual segment is a miniature structure complete beginning, middle, and end. And in fact, towards the end of the movie, where the climax of a traditional structure would go, those are when the events are the most intense. And so it actually even fits sort of a larger structure if you take a sort of step back and look at it in terms of rising tension and the character's emotional journey. Those story checkpoints almost work out perfectly as well. Magnolia is a movie that is almost entirely subplots. And in fact, there are so many plots going on, it's difficult sometimes to tell what the main plot is. But each of those subplots, even though they're chopped up and scattered throughout the entire 2-hour movie, they each have complete story structures as well. And some of the stories come together in ways. And again, if you look at the moments where the first turning point should be, that's a moment where there will be a moment that is a game changer for many of the subplots. And they're related enough that one moment will frequently play into many of the other subplots. And as an audience, we may not get to see them all, but we'll get to imagine the way that they're tying together and what the effect that this turning point has on the others as we pick them up in Act 2 going into Act 3. And again, also if you look at the climax, all of the events tie into this thing that happens, this quirk of the weather, that results in climaxes through many of the subplots. So if you look for story structure in successful films, it is always there. And it is possible it can get much more complicated, as with Run Lola Run, where instead of structuring one movie with a complete story structure, there is actually 3 complete story structures. Again, with the subplots, you'll have as many complete story arcs as there are characters who overcome flaws. Now, not every character in Magnolia is considered a protagonist, because not everyone overcomes their flaw, and not all of the subplots do include complete arcs, but those that do are probably the ones that you remember the most and sympathize the most with those characters. So what's coming up in the next couple of lessons is an introduction to 4-act structure, which gets talked about in television a lot, but also works for movies, and is kind of 3-act structure in disguise. And then we'll get into really in-depth 3-act structure discussions, where we'll break down each act and talk about the checkpoints that your character goes through in each of those. So I will see you there. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about 4-act structure. Now, what I've realized slowly is that 4-act structure is really just 3-act structure in disguise, but you do hear them talked about differently, so it's worth taking a look at both. The 3-act structure that we're going to talk about in the next lesson is based on Steve Alcorn's 9 checkpoints, which we'll get into in more detail then. But for now, let's break down the 4 acts. So the way that I've chosen to label them at this point is Act 1, Act 2A, Act 2B, and Act 3, so that you can see the relationship between this structural pattern and traditional 3-act structure, which you encounter in novels all the time. And frequently in Hollywood, you'll also hear people talking about 3-act structure. So in this format, in a 2-hour movie, all of the acts are the same length. They're all 30 pages, which gets you to your total of 120. And this is the page breakdown that you'll find. Now, let's take a closer look at each of the acts and what belongs in each one. So, Act 1, the most important job of this act is to introduce the characters. We need to know who the protagonist is, and we need to bond with the protagonist. We probably also need to be introduced to the antagonist, although it's possible we may not encounter the antagonist until Act 2, 2A in this case. But probably they'll be introduced in Act 1 as well. We also need to know who the most important members of the help and opposition are going to be. You also need to introduce the setting and situation. We need to see just a little bit of the character at status quo before the inciting incident occurs. Where are they living? Is it suburbia? Are they upper class, middle class, low class? Sort of things about where they are that are going to be important for the story later on. And we also need to identify and introduce the situation. So we're probably not following this character on a completely ordinary day. Something out of the ordinary is going to happen, which is what's making it a story-worthy moment for us to be zooming in on. Act 1 also needs to include the inciting incident. This is something that the character does that is out of the ordinary and kicks off the story. we also need to know what the protagonist's goal is. This is really vital. We need to know what it is that they want so that we can either be rooting for them so that they get it, but what they want may not necessarily be what they need, so we could also be rooting for them to realize that as well. Act 1 ends with turning point 1, and turning point 1 is a moment that shifts the direction the story is going in. In this moment, the character makes an action or something happens that is a game changer and sort of alters the direction that we have been on, which kicks off Act 2. And in Act 2, the hero begins their journey, and they're met with conflict and obstacles. I know it seems cruel, but the best thing you can do as a screenwriter is to just keep bombarding your protagonist with more and more conflict and more obstacles. The meaner you can be to them, the better the final product will be. You just need to just keep throwing things at them. And then there's sort of this mini midpoint of this act, which is pinch point 1. And this is sort of like a smaller version of the midpoint of the movie. And this is probably a fairly pivotal moment in your script, and particularly within Act 2A in this case. It'll be, again, kind of a moment worth highlighting. And we'll talk more about that after we talk about the midpoint. And Act 2A ends with the midpoint. And the midpoint is very important in cinema. And this literally divides your movie in half. It should come as close to the middle of your movie as possible. And conventional wisdom about the midpoint says that it is the opposite in emotional tonality of your ending, which means that if you're writing something that has a happily ever after, the midpoint is going to be the darkest moment. It's going to be very sad. Something bad is going to happen to your protagonist in that moment. Audiences don't necessarily know this structure, you have to realize. However, because it's used so often, really audiences are looking for these cues. So if you get to about the hour mark, and something really bad happens, we're expecting that something really good is going to happen at the end of the movie. On the flip side, if the movie ends in tragedy, the midpoint probably contains something really good for your protagonist. And we'll actually see an example of that in just a bit. But this mini midpoint is sort of a smaller version of that within an act. And you'll also find that there is one in Act 2B. So, in Act 2B, fresh out of the midpoint, the protagonist has to continue trying to achieve their goal, which was set up in Act 1. However, they're probably trying to go about it in a new way. And in fact, at this point in the movie, perhaps the goal has broadened for something that was very sort of self-centered to being something about others. Think about Erin Brockovich. Her goal in the beginning was to get a job, and by the time we get into the second half of Act 2 of Erin Brockovich, she has become an advocate for an entire community of people. So her goal has definitely broadened at that point. Act 2B also has another pinch point, which is another mini midpoint, which is sort of a spike in dramatic or emotional tension. And then Act 2B also has the dark moment. And this is what immediately precedes the epiphany, which we'll talk about when we get to the checkpoints in the next lesson. But this dark moment, the character has been pushed, your protagonist has been pushed as low as they can go. You have just thrown one obstacle and one conflict after another at them, and they literally can go no lower within the confines of the stakes of your story. And so in this moment, this is the make or break moment that causes them to have their epiphany, and this act ends with turning point 2, which is a decision or action that they make or take as a result of having had this epiphany, which launches us into Act 3. And in Act 3, the tension continues to rise until you reach the climax, which is the final battle with the antagonist. And this will probably be the most intense moment of your screenplay. This will be, the highest number of explosions, the greatest tension, the most emotional turmoil, whatever it is, whatever genre you're writing in, this is going to be the epitome and the most that you can possibly throw at it in this moment. And then finally you have the resolution, which is how everything gets wrapped up and tied together. And then also a final image, which is what you want your audience to be left with at the end of your story. So, Here is a warning that I'm about to analyze Titanic using all of these elements. So if you haven't seen Titanic, please pause this video, go out, and rent it, and watch it, because it is so well structured. It is really a fabulous film. So, without further ado, the structure of Titanic, beginning with Act 1. Alright, so, begins fairly easily, right? We're introducing the characters. The first people that we see are the treasure hunters who are diving down to the Titanic, including Lovett. And then we are soon introduced to Rose, Cal, and Jack. Introducing the setting and situation, in the present, we have Lovett looking for the heart of the ocean, and in the past, Rose is sailing on the Titanic. Pretty simple. The inciting incident is the ship sailing. This is the thing that doesn't happen every day of a character's life. So, that moment launches us out. And because Titanic is pretty long, it's about 3 hours. In fact, I believe the runtime was 3 hours and 7 minutes total. These numbers that I'm going to quote to you in terms of time points where it happens are a little bit longer usually than you would find in a traditional 2-hour movie. However, it's basically, if you do the math, perfectly divided up into equal chunks. So 1 to 10 minutes, you're meeting the crew diving down to Titanic. 11 minutes, the drawing of Rose is uncovered, and we sort of have this situation starting to form because we're raising story questions, because we also know that they're looking for the heart of the ocean. At 13 minutes, you meet old Rose, and she says that the woman in the picture is me, and now we're definitely locked in. At 17 minutes, we answer the question, what is the present story about? Because Lovett is looking for the diamond, and Rose is his new best friend. At 25 minutes, the ship sets sail, and that's our inciting incident. And again, that's a little bit later than you'd probably find in a 2-hour movie. In a 2-hour movie, the ship probably would have set sail closer to the 10 to 15 minute mark. But throughout the rest of this act, the protagonist's goal is not explicitly stated in this, but it is clearly to escape her constraining life, both from her mother and her fiancé. And throughout this, we start to learn some more details about Rose and Jack, because Jack is also introduced as a character. But the most important one, I think, is that Rose is established very early on as an art lover, which sets us up for why she and Jack hit it off later. So the turning point that ends Act 1 is that Jack saves Rose when she tries to commit suicide off the back of the ship. He talks her down, brings her back, and pulls her over the edge. This launches us into Act 2. So Act 2A, the hero begins her journey. Rose seeks out Jack. Her goal was to escape her constraining life. Jack is perhaps her best way to do this. The conflict and the obstacles as they get to know one another, Cal and her mother continue to try and control her. Anything that's keeping them apart, the barriers between first class and third class, these all count as obstacles. And then the pinch point of this act is when Jack attends dinner in the first class dining room in a borrowed tux. He doesn't fit in, but he clearly doesn't care. And also he and Rose continue to hit it off, and at the end of that scene, he invites her into his world, and we've sort of launched ourselves into what the next several important plot points are going to be. So this includes ending with the midpoint when they make love in the car in the baggage compartment down at the bottom of the ship. Also, immediately after that, at about the 1 hour and 37 minute mark, they're out on deck, and Rose states that when the ship docks, I'm getting off with you. And that's sort of a moment where they are explicitly tied together. However, immediately after that, they hit the iceberg. And this launches us into 2B. Also notice how that midpoint is that's what we've been rooting for the last hour and a half. We want these characters together, and now they're together. However, because we know that we're about halfway through the movie, and this is a really good thing for them, we're suspecting that this is going to end in tragedy. So, 2B. Throughout the beginning of Act 2B, Rose and Jack struggle to survive and stay together as the situation deteriorates. When the iceberg first hits, they're not even sure that they're really sinking. After all, they are on Titanic, which is said to be unsinkable. However, as things get worse and worse, it becomes apparent that the ship is actually going to go down, and that there are not enough lifeboats. So pinch point 2, Jack is locked up. This is a little mini disaster in the middle of this act, and the dark moment occurs when Rose gets talked into taking a lifeboat. So Jack is locked up at about 1 hour and 55 minutes. Rose gets talked into taking the lifeboat at about 2:18, but then at 2:19, this act ends with turning point 2, where Rose takes action and jumps out of the lifeboat and runs back onto the ship to be with Jack because of the you jump, I jump thing that they've established throughout, and that she's not going to leave him behind, that she couldn't live with herself if she got on the lifeboat alone. And so that gets us into Act 3, where we're heading towards the climax. So the tension rises. The ship is sinking. Cal shoots at them. All the lifeboats are gone. There's disaster after disaster after disaster in the first part of this act. And then the climax is kind of interesting in this because the issue of who is the antagonist in this movie is kind of an interesting one, I think. Because in some sense, this is one of the few examples I can think of where you can really think of the ship itself as the antagonist. Its sinking is what is keeping Rose from obtaining her goal, which at this point is to be with Jack. However, through the first part of the movie, that wouldn't really have worked because the ship wasn't actively doing anything to combat them. So Cal has sort of been the personification of all that's keeping them apart. And so he is also defeated in this act because they run away from him. And in fact, his line is, I hope you enjoy your time together, as he lets them go and then gets off on one of the last lifeboats. So he's defeated a little bit earlier, but then I think that the real climax of this movie is when the ship actually sinks. I also like this because Rose and Jack find themselves in the same spot that they were when they met at the back of the ship, where he saved her the first time, and this time they're going down together. And so that is definitely one of the most intense moments of this film. So I think that's the climax. And it wraps up pretty quickly after that, because the ship sinks at 2:44, and the resolution is we find out who has the diamond in the present. Old Rose walks out on the deck of the ship and opens up her hands, revealing the heart of the ocean. And then in the past, immediately it cuts back to Rose taking her hand into the pocket that Cal has put the coat around her when she gets to New York, and she pulls out the diamond. And we realize that all of these years she's had it. So now this clears up the story question that got raised way back at the beginning of Act 1, which was, who has the diamond? Where is it? That question was very quickly subsumed by the plot of the story that Rose is telling about the past and the love story between Rose and Jack. However, at the end, James Cameron has mirrored this. In the first act, he's raised the question, and in the very end of the third act, he's answered the question. You also get a really nice statement of theme at the end of this act at 3 hours and 2 minutes. Rose says, "He saved me in every way that a person can be saved." And I think that that really ties into what this movie is about. This movie clearly has a lot going on. It has a lot of themes, but one of them is love and sacrifice. And right there, that's it. And I think that one of the most important resolutions, and what really puts the button on this and makes it such a good and memorable story, is the shot that pans across all of the photos in Rose's cabin. All of the things she did with her life because Jack saved her and got her out of that oppressive environment that she was in. You know, she learns to fly and ride a horse like a man, which is one of the things that they talked about that they were going to do together. And so I think that that shot is the emotional payoff and makes us feel better about the fact that they didn't get to spend their lives together. And then obviously the final image is the return to Titanic and true love, which again sort of softens the blow of this very tragic story that we've just watched. I think that Titanic is one of the best examples of a well-structured film out there. There are also many moments that mirror towards the beginning and the end that I didn't have time to point out in this. So I definitely suggest taking a good look at this. James Cameron, if nothing else, knows his structure. So if you want to look at some great examples of structure like this, check out Titanic and Avatar. Definitely recommend using them. In the supplemental material for this week, you will see that there is a quick reference guide for 4-act structure as well as a test drive, which you can apply to your own story idea. But I also encourage you to practice by applying it to other movies that you see. So if you go out to the theater this weekend, give it a shot, write it down, jot down some notes about where things fell throughout the movie. You'll find that this is a very useful technique, so it's worth it to practice both on your own ideas and also on movies that have been made into real things. So, that was a quick blow-by-blow of 4-act structure and Titanic and how it works together. I will see you here for a discussion of 3-act structure in the next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed our discussion of 4-act structure using Titanic as an example. In this lesson, we're going to turn our attention to 3-act structure, which is the traditional story structuring technique of novels and that many people use in Hollywood. So let's take a look. Well, here's sort of a sketch of basically what 3-act structure looks like, and I'm betting that this looks very familiar from high school English classes. You have your Act 1 and your Act 2, and you have a steady increase in the tension of the story that peaks in Act 3 at the climax and then dissolves and is resolved at the end of the story. So you can kind of see here that especially 4-act structure, labeling the middle acts 2A and 2B, that it almost fits right on top of this diagram. And so when I approach a screenplay, 4-act structure is more tied to script length and page count. And so I find that it is helpful for me to keep that on the back of my mind as I plan out at what pages these acts should fall. But the 3-act structure, as you'll see on the next slides that follow, is more tied to the actual plotting and story events of the movie that I'm trying to write. So I usually end up using the 3-act paradigm, but keep my eye on the page counts from the 4-act structure. And sometimes the turning points can be helpful in structuring Act 2 as well. So this very steady rise doesn't really represent what stories are actually like, what movies are actually like when you watch them, because each period of intense action is usually followed by a brief respite. And so this diagram here includes the story checkpoints that we're about to talk about in this lesson and the ones that follow in the act breakdown. And so you can see here that we have sort of steady rising tension during Act 1, but then Act 2 is a sequence of rises in tensions and then brief release, rise in tension, brief release, rise in tension, brief release, and then we still peak at the climax and then very quickly resolve that tension in the resolution. So the story structuring checkpoints that we're going to talk about are these 9. So Act 1 involves the hook, which is something that quickly gets your reader's attention and makes them interested in watching more. The backstory is where we find out the rules of the world. We find out a little bit about the character, anything we need to know that will make the rest of the movie make sense. And then the trigger is an event that sort of launches the protagonist into the journey that we have set out for them, because it directly attacks their flaw, but in a way that they cannot yet overcome. Which leads us into Act 2, which begins with the crisis. And this is a moment that I sort of like to think of as a failed epiphany. This is a moment where if the protagonist had realized what their flaw was, they would have been able to take some action and the story would have been over. Now, of course, if that happens, you have no movie, and so they fail to overcome that flaw in this moment, and that launches them into the struggle, which is the longest chunk of any story, novel or movie. And this is pretty much all of the plot details. This is all of the things that go wrong, all of the things that they try and do, every bad thing that happens to the character pretty much is happening in the struggle. Act 2 ends with the epiphany, which is when the character realizes what their flaw is and is able to overcome it. And in overcoming that flaw, they're able to launch themselves into Act 3, beginning with a plan. Now, there might be a couple of plans that the protagonist tries to come up with to defeat the antagonist, but ultimately it resolves in the climax, which is the moment of highest tension in your screenplay. This is the big one. This is the final confrontation, the final showdown between the protagonist and the antagonist. And then very quickly after that, you want to sort of get to this resolution where you've tied up as many loose ends as you're going to and leave the audience with your final image. So let's take some examples from great screenplays. So good story structuring, any kids movie, any Disney movie that you can think of is going to be really well structured. Kids movies are sort of the paragon of story structure. bad examples, and I'm painting with a very, very broad brush here because there are clearly numerous counterexamples. But action movies tend to fail in the story structure checkpoint sometimes because they'll hit all of the plot elements and miss the story elements. So if you've ever seen a movie where it was really exciting and you were entertained, but when you left you felt like you didn't know anything about the protagonist and it was vaguely unsatisfying, it's probably because they'd missed out on the character's emotional journey. So that said, it is possible to make a well-structured movie in any genre, and we're going to use these 9 checkpoints to show you how to do that. I find that plot tends to take care of itself, and story is much harder. So using these checkpoints is really helpful for me as I keep my eye on the protagonist's journey to make sure that I'm not losing the emotional trip that they're taking. The next 3 lessons, we're going to be using Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, as an example of our story structuring checkpoint. So if on the off chance you have not seen that movie yet, I highly suggest this would be a great time for you to go out and rent it and check it out because there will be some spoilers that come up. So, supplemental material for this week's lesson. There is a 3-act quick reference guide that you can check out and sort of tape next to your monitor as you start working on your own screenplay. So I will see you in our next lesson for a discussion of a breakdown of Act 1. See you then. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to take an in-depth look at the story structure checkpoints found in Act 1. As a quick reminder, we're using Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, as our example for these story structure checkpoints in this and the next 2 lessons. So if by chance you have not seen that film, I highly recommend you pause this right now and go out, rent it, and take a look. Alright, let's start with a quick reminder of the story structure checkpoints that we're going to find in Act 1. They are the hook, backstory, and trigger. Now, let's dig deeper into each one of those and figure out what we really mean by it. Beginning with the hook. So here you have a couple of goals. Your primary goal is to establish at least one story question. If you don't raise any story questions in this first part of your screenplay, the audience or reader is not going to have any reason to keep turning pages or to keep watching. They need to have questions that they need answers to, which will keep them interested and engaged. Your best chance of doing this is to begin with action or dialogue. Beginning with action or dialogue gives the reader or the audience something very compelling to latch onto right at the beginning, which will keep them interested and engaged. You also want to choose a starting point that is as late as possible. For the most part, stories are about moments in a character's life. There are a few exceptions, and one that leaps to the top of my head is The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, that deals with the entire lifespan of a protagonist. But for the most part, your story is not going to be about somebody from birth to death, but rather it's going to be about a moment in their life that may be less than a year, it may be a couple of days, or in some extreme cases, like The Breakfast Club, it's only a few hours, or Run Lola Run, it's only 20 minutes of a character's life. So there is something unusual and out of the ordinary that is happening to this person that makes this a story-worthy occasion. Now, you also usually want to begin with your protagonist in the hook, because you don't want to have your reader or audience accidentally bond with the wrong character, only to be disappointed when they realize that the story is not actually about them. So, Star Wars is actually a little bit unusual at this checkpoint, because it begins with that very iconic opening shot of the text scrolling up into space. And that's a little unusual, because that's quite an information dump. That requires a lot of cognitive resources on the part of the viewer to read through that, sort through all of the names and unfamiliar terminology, as well as dealing with a completely foreign political ideology that they have no pre-existing knowledge of. A more traditional hook occurs immediately after that shot, which is the space battle. Specifically the line, "There's no escape for the princess this time." Now that line right there raises a lot of story questions. For one, why is there no escape for the princess? 2, she's done this before? And also, who is the princess? That's a lot of questions right there that I'm going to want answers to, and so I'll keep watching. Now, the other unusual thing about the Star Wars hook is that it does not actually begin with the protagonist. In fact, the first people that we see on screen are the robots. But the audience probably knows that neither of these are the protagonist in the way that they're introduced. They seem a little bit bumbling, and they're not quite your normal hero type. We also see Princess Leia, but again, we're not really convinced that she's the protagonist because we don't get her point of view really on things. She's just sort of there as part of what's happening in this space battle on this spaceship that we're still struggling to come to terms with. None of the character introductions in the first 5 minutes or so of this movie are consistent with the character introduction that we would expect for a protagonist. And in fact, this is highlighted by Darth Vader's character introduction, which is paired with that very definitive music cue, which absolutely screams antagonist. And so having such a strong antagonist introduction makes us realize that we have not yet met the protagonist. So this can be very effective because since we are aware of the fact that we're still looking for and waiting the protagonist, in a sense it's almost a story question in and of itself, is from whose point of view is this story going to get told once we establish the backstory? Which leads us to our next checkpoint, which is backstory. And here, backstory is anything that has brought the character to this point in time. It's any important details about their past or history that are going to be important markers for what happens in Acts 2 and Act 3, the events that play out. So the fact that Luke is an orphan is going to be really important, so that's something that you would need to draw out in this period of backstory. But the backstory is also a place to establish the rules of the world in which you're playing with. This is less important if you're setting your story in a contemporary place, but for the world of Star Wars, we need to know, is light speed travel possible? What kind of weapons are there? You know, do we need to know things about the politics and who's got the power and all of these things? So these are all elements that we need to introduce. We also need to introduce the supporting characters in the backstory. So the most important ways to introduce the backstory for film are going to be dialogue and flashbacks. Although the flashbacks, don't think that just because there's an event in the past that is important, the fact that Luke is an orphan, means that it needs to have a flashback. There are other ways to get that information out there in terms of drawing out conversations with other people. And so in fact, I think that dialogue is really what you want to be relying heavily on in your backstory section for things that happened in the past, as well as character reveals. You really want to avoid exposition, which is long monologues about things. You really should figure out a way to do it in a more naturalistic way, a more organic way. And it may be incomplete and you can flesh it out later, that's completely fine. It's also very important that in the backstory we begin to see the protagonist taking action so that we begin to understand what their goal, flaw, and situation is. So now, the backstory elements that get introduced in Star Wars early on. We get a piece of information about Darth Vader from Leia. She says, "Darth Vader, only you would be so bold." That tells us a lot about him. It sort of establishes that they have a relationship of some sort that is very antagonistic and that she's willing to confront him. And it also indicates that he's maybe a little bit reckless. These are all things that may not necessarily play out, but this is what we're thinking at the time. And then we also get a conflicting view because he responds to her, "You are part of the Rebel Alliance and a traitor." Now that's pretty strong language, so at this point, since we don't know who our protagonist is, we're not 100% sure whose side we're on, so we're seeing some conflict here, which is making us more interested. We also learn very early that R2-D2 has the Death Star plans. We learn that Luke lives in the middle of nowhere and that he is an orphan. We also learn that Ben Kenobi is his friend and mentor, and he's going to tell Luke about the Jedi Knights and the Force. Now, Act 1 ends with the trigger, and the trigger is just a moment, which probably means that it occurs on one page of your screenplay and is less than a minute long. And this is a moment or event that directly attacks the protagonist's flaw. And the trigger, it should be noted, is not a decision or action by the protagonist. It is something that happens to the protagonist, a situation that they find themselves in, an event that happens to them, and their response to it is an opportunity for a failed epiphany, which is the crisis, which we will see in the next lesson when we talk about Act 2 in depth. So the trigger in Star Wars is that Ben tells Luke he must face Darth Vader. That's the literal, just the tiny moment where he tells him that is the trigger. So, your test drive for this week, now that you have a story idea of your own, is to begin playing around with the story structuring techniques. So, what you should do is for each of the 3 checkpoints in this section is write down a sentence or two describing what happens in your story in that checkpoint. The backstory may be a little bit longer. You may mean more like a paragraph for the backstory. But the hook should pretty much be a sentence, the trigger should pretty much be a sentence, and then the backstory, at this point, just worry about hitting the highlights. What are the most important pieces of information about the character or about the world in which they live that your audience is going to need to know to understand the rest of your story to come? And I will see you next time for a discussion of Act 2. See you then. Hello, and welcome back. We now turn our attention towards Act 2 and the checkpoints that make up this middle chunk of your movie. So, the checkpoints that we're going to find here are the crisis, struggle, and epiphany. So here we have 2 story moments, the crisis and epiphany, sandwiching a whole bunch of plot. So let's take a look at each one of those and talk about what exactly it means. Now, the crisis is an internal moment. There is absolutely no plot here. This is a story moment for your protagonist where their flaw has been attacked and they don't know what their flaw is, so they can't overcome it. This is a moment that I like to think of often as a failed epiphany, where if the character had realized what their flaw is, they would have been able to overcome it and stop things right here, solve their problem right here. But they can't, because if they did, you'd have no story. So what happens is that as a result of this, they either take an action that doesn't help, or they fail to take an action and get launched into the struggle, which are the events in the middle part of this act. But it is important to remember that the emotions of the crisis carry throughout the struggle of Act 2 and are resolved in the epiphany. So this may be a moment where your protagonist begins to suspect what their flaw is and they just can't quite come to terms with it or recognize it yet, but this is definitely going to shadow what comes. And so in Star Wars, the crisis occurs immediately after the trigger, and the trigger was Obi-Wan telling Luke that he had to face Darth Vader. Luke refuses and leaves Ben. Now, the refusal is the crisis. He doesn't believe that he can do it. His flaw is a lack of self-confidence, and being told that he has to face down one of the greatest warlords in the universe attacks that, and he doesn't believe in himself, and he says no thank you and walks away. Now, the struggle begins when he leaves Ben and returns to his farm. Now, the struggle, here what you have to do as a writer is keep up the stakes. Make sure that there's never too big a release in tension. You want to keep ratcheting things up and ratcheting things up and ratcheting things up. And also at this point, somewhere in the middle, your protagonist is going to find a cause that's greater than himself. And this is important because otherwise your protagonist may seem a little bit too self-centered. And so, especially for flaws like, not believing in yourself, obviously that is something that is very much about you, but can be used to help other people, just as Luke does. This is also where the antagonist appears if they haven't already. Now in Star Wars, the antagonist actually appeared before the protagonist, so we're all good. But this is about the last possible moment that you can introduce your antagonist, if it's not already been established. And the struggle is really just a series of plot complications, as things get progressively worse for the protagonist. So this is all of the stuff that happens in the middle of a movie. All of the things that go wrong, all of the plans that go amiss, all of the bad things that happen. And at the end of the struggle, it's a great spot for there to be a black moment, where the protagonist has just been pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed, and there's no place else for them to go, and they are as low as they can be emotionally at that moment. Now, some of the elements that take place in the struggle of Star Wars are that Luke and Ben hire Han Solo to take them to the Death Star, Luke discovers Leia is being held prisoner and he rescues her, Ben sacrifices himself so the rest of them can escape. All of that stuff happens in the struggle. The struggle ends when the character reaches their epiphany. And the epiphany, again, is a story moment. It is a brief internal moment. The protagonist finally realizes what we've known all along, which is his flaw. And most importantly, he decides to change. He realizes, my flaw is fill in the blank. If only I didn't feel that way or believe that, I would be able to accomplish my goal. Now, if the story is a tragedy, none of these things happen. And even if the protagonist recognizes their flaw, they decide not to change or they fail to change, and the story ends in tragedy because they are defeated by the antagonist. Again, must emphasize here that the epiphany is not plot. This is story. Now, your challenge as a screenwriter is that we've just said that this is an internal moment, and that is absolutely true. However, you are going to have to come up with a way to visually show an internal moment. This could be as simple as, a light bulb moment. How would you describe the physicality of a light bulb moment? Or it may be something that the character says. That's a great way to get at what's happening inside. If you're writing in a specific style, you might even be able to get away with a voiceover for what they've realized. Although I think that dialogue is probably usually your best go-to approach, unless you discover that for some reason that really doesn't work and you need something else to indicate to the reader and the audience what the epiphany is. Now, Luke's epiphany is, I must believe in myself. And if I believe in myself, I will be able to use the Force and destroy the Death Star. That's Act 2. So your test drive is now to continue expanding on your story checkpoint outline. And again, write a sentence or two about the crisis and the epiphany. And then, again, you may need about a paragraph for the struggle. And just hit the highlights here. There will be plenty of chances for you to expand upon this. And at the end of this section, we're going to talk about outlining and how to do that. So just hit the highlights right now for the struggle. But begin to sort of extend your idea farther into Act 2, making sure that the trigger attacks the character's flaw and that the crisis is resolved in the epiphany. And I will see you next time for a discussion of the resolution of your film and Act 3. See you then. Hello, and welcome back. We'll now turn our attention towards your third and final act. As a quick reminder, the 3 story structure checkpoints that we'll see in Act 3 are the plan, climax, and resolution. Now, the plan is all plot. It's something that your protagonist could not have done before he changed in the epiphany. The epiphany allows him to realize his flaw and overcome it, which allows him to come up with this plan, which would not have worked prior to the epiphany. Now, the first plan may not work. There may be multiple plans. And if you're writing a tragedy, in fact, none of these plans will work because your protagonist didn't change in the epiphany and is not able to do the thing that would allow them to accomplish their goal in the climax, and they will be defeated by the antagonist. However, in traditional story structure, the final plan is successful and the antagonist is defeated in the climax, which is the next checkpoint. Now, in Star Wars, Luke's plan is actually very short because of where the epiphany falls. His epiphany is, I need to believe in myself. If I believe in myself, I will be able to destroy the Death Star. So really, it's something where he approaches the target and is doing the very impressive flying maneuvers as he's losing the people who are pursuing him, including Darth Vader. So that's probably only a couple of minutes in the finished version of the movie. The plan could be significantly longer. Something in, for instance, a heist-type movie might take significantly more time to develop, where the protagonist has overcome his flaw and is able to institute a new plan that will finally work in allowing him to accomplish his goal and get into the vault or whatnot. The climax is the next checkpoint, and it is very important for the protagonist to be active at this moment. You don't want his problem solved by the cavalry. And it's also important to have the antagonist be defeated by their own flaw. this is why it's important to give your antagonist a flaw in the first place, is that if they had seen their flaw and overcome it in this moment, they would have been able to defeat the protagonist. So we've been on the protagonist's side the entire time, so we're rooting for them, but what we really want to see is the antagonist defeated as a result of their own flaw. Because we want to keep the protagonist sympathetic. We don't want them to become the bad guy. We don't want them to become the bully. We don't want them to become the antagonist. So it is always more rewarding to see an antagonist fall because of something they failed to do or something they failed to change about themselves, even if the protagonist managed to put them in a situation which caused that to occur. Also, keep in mind that the antagonist's defeat should be consistent with the weight of the story. As I've mentioned before, if you're writing a story about a bunch of middle schoolers, the stakes are not life and death, so the antagonist's defeat is going to be a lot milder, if you will, than in an action-adventure story where the antagonist very well might die. It's also possible to rehabilitate the antagonist after they are defeated, if you want. And in fact, as we will see in later Star Wars movies, Darth Vader is to a certain extent rehabilitated. So, at the climax of Star Wars A New Hope is that Luke pulls the trigger. He's very active and accomplishes his goal, which is blowing up the Death Star. Darth Vader is defeated by his own flaw, which is overconfidence. He didn't believe that anybody could manage to do this, and he spins off into space. So we need to keep him around for the sequels, and because eventually they're going to rehabilitate him. So, this brings us to the resolution. And here, the journey is over. Loose ends get tied up, the protagonist has a brief opportunity to reflect on the events that brought them to this point and contemplate what comes next. And the final image allows the viewers to start sorting out how they feel about what they've just seen. If a movie just ended at the climax, it would sort of have this feeling of whiplash, where you had been really along for this ride, but you've been wound up and wound up and wound up, and as we've said before, the climax is the highest moment of tension in the story, and were the film to just end there and the credits start rolling, the audience is probably going to feel vaguely unsatisfied. There may be questions that they still have. They may feel like they didn't get a chance to sort of start processing how they felt about the journey that the protagonist had been on. And also, it's always nice to see how the protagonist feels about the journey that they've been on. And so in Star Wars, the resolution is the rebels have a ceremony, Luke and his companions get awarded medals by Princess Leia, and we know that Luke will continue to fight with the rebels. If you're setting up a sequel, the resolution can be a little bit open-ended. We're going to have a lesson on beginnings and endings, and talk about what techniques work well if you're writing a standalone. If you're writing a sequel, again, the open-ended probably leaves you the most story questions to continue in your second and third movies. So, this week, Test Drive is again to continue extending that checkpoint outline for yourself. So here you have the plan and climax, which are all plot, and then the resolution, which is probably a mix of plot and story elements. So, with these lessons, or with these checkpoints rather, keep in mind that the plan needs to be something that the protagonist could not have done before they realized their flaw. It has to be directly related in some way to whatever the realization the protagonist had in the epiphany was. If the protagonist has an epiphany that is unrelated to the plan, then we just wonder, why didn't they come up with that plan sooner? The climax, again, make sure that this is the moment of highest tension, this is where the antagonist will be defeated, and spend some time thinking about how to make sure that your protagonist stays sympathetic during this moment where they're defeating the antagonist. And again, this is another spot to check in and see how your antagonist flaw is mirroring or in some way working in concert with your protagonist's flaw to make this really emotionally satisfying. And then finally, your resolution, take some time to think about that final image that you'd like to leave your viewers with that will help them process the story that you have just told. So I will see you next time